and welcome to Radio Free Nintendo. It is July 11th, 2024, and I am James Jones. I'm joined today by Mr. Guillaume Vayette.
Hello and good evening.
I don't like this enthusiasm.
No, I was trying to spike your audio just like you spiked my headphones.
Well, just get a noise suppressor. It's not that hard, man. Come on. It's 2024. I'm also joined by the noise suppressor himself, Mr. John Lindemann. I don't know.
Greetings and salutations, James.
Oh, I don't know how to feel about. So I've got like staid John Lindemann, and I've got vindictive Guillaume audio pop over here. Greg Leahy, what are you going to give me?
Oh, hoy, everyone. The same thing that everyone.
Yeah, it will level anyway, like I'm not going to maintain the kind of vindictive energy
you should.
The whole time through. Like I can't.
But you'll get me if you don't use the compressor on that one section. You'll get me when I listen to the show.
Nice.
So you still got a chance. This is episode 883. Yes, because 882 was named after opioids and beer, so that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to start this episode off with listener mail because it's been a little bit since we've done a good listener mail segment. We've actually got a nice little run of listener mail in the last couple weeks, and so I'd like to see that continue. We want your emails, and you can send them to rfn@nintendoworldreport.com. That's rfn@nintendoworldreport.com. It's an email address. Email is what your grandparents used to send communication back and forth during the war. Our first email this week, I will read it. It comes from Christian, who writes, "Hi, RFN. I had an idea for an email while I was eating some chicken wings today and thought I would go ahead and share. This is an auspicious start. If you are listening right now, eating chicken wings, rfn@nintendoworldreport.com. Wipe your fingers down before you touch your phone or your keyboard because you're going to get
And what's
sauce.
being left out here is that it's at Hooters. So,
I mean, sure.
Is it not obvious?
I mean, of the chains, in terms of the actual quality of food, I guess you could do worse. You could be at like a B-Dubs where it's just going to be like, we deep fried gristle.
But also, you don't have to use your hands. Just, go bobbing for apples, but with chicken wings.
Oh,
it's fine.
Okay. All right. I thought you were going to recommend, like, utensils, and I was going to get upset. But no, if you're just going face first into the wings, getting that sauce up in your eyes, you're a braver man than I am. And I respect it. Will the people at the restaurant respect? No, they will not respect it. But we respect you as you pepper spray yourself with your own food. So, emails go to rfn@nintendoworldreport.com. That's rfn@nintendoworldreport.com. rfn@nintendoworldreport.com. I gave you about an octave and a half of range on that. So whatever strikes your ears best, I got you covered. It's weird. Not this part. We're back to the email. It's weird when you can remember a time when every popular new movie that came out would inevitably have a game based on it and come out soon after. Sometimes they come out before, just as an aside. But he's right, yes. We've pretty much reversed this now. Popular and acclaimed TV shows are being made based on games. But I was thinking about all the shows from the so-called golden era of TV that don't have video game adaptations. There's no proper Breaking Bad game. And if these Thomas Camelot Dune movies came out 20 years ago, you could be sure there would be a couple of very mid Dune games out now. More on that later. Are there movies or shows you wish had games based on them, even if they were not good? Thanks for answering and for going above and beyond mid every week. I can't thank you enough for telling us that we're not mid. That's the highest praise we get, which is not saying much, but hey, it's fine. I'm trying to think, when did the age of big movie get game end? It was definitely still going strong on the GameCube.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you had Charlie's Angels, you had Minority Report, you had like a Xena game, or was that N64?
The Xena game was on the N64. I had it. It's a fighting game. It's very bad. Catwoman is one of the infamous NWR reviews, as was Charlie's Angels, with the only pro being if you could put a bullet through the center of the disc, you're a good shot.
That's the thing. That's one of the sort of dividing lines in my mind would probably be kind of the transition from, I think, probably like the mid-aughts where it was still happening, especially at GBA. GBA had all sorts of weird, and some of that carried into the DS as well. Again in the mid-aughts. Then when you got to the later part, the end of that decade. I feel like the dividing line is like, I think what Batman Begins, didn't that have like a really bad game or some sort of bad Batman game that came around that time? But then when you get to the time that like Dark Knight is coming out, it's more like, oh, we've got Arkham now. We've got, we've got video games of Batman that are not adaptations of the Nolan movies, which would, especially Dark Knight was huge in terms of commercially, quite a lot bigger than Batman Begins, but it's like, we're not doing that anymore. We're not doing the kind of just do a movie tie-in thing. We're handling it its own way, and it's for the best.
So the 2005 King Kong film, this is the Naomi Watts, Jack Black, Adrian Brody one.
Peter Jackson, and his name was on the video game a bit, right? In terms of like, he was
Peter
involved.
Jackson's King Kong, the game, I believe is what it was called.
Or the movie, the game?
The movie, the game, maybe. Some of the early Marvel movies had them as well. There was an Iron Man game that Sega produced, I believe.
Yeah, the very beginning.
I don't know if I'm right or I'm wrong, but like to me, in my mind, that was the beginning of the end, because that game was just so terrible, Go ahead.
But that was normal. Those games were always bad.
Yeah, they were often not great. Yeah, I mean, there were some exceptions, but a lot of the time they weren't particularly good.
Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, excellent game.
I think there was the Way Forward Thor game, right? Like on DS, I want to say.
Yeah,
which had some nice sprite work. I don't know how great the game was at all, but I mean, as you'd expect from Way Forward, the sprite work was nice.
I mean, the Hulk game was supposed to be pretty good.
So again, the very beginning,
not the PlayStation 3 or 360 game. That one was bad, but the GameCube game was not based on any movie, and that was a good one. Ultimate Destruction.
Yeah, the Iron Man game reviewed okay.
So, and that was, the very beginning of the cinematic universe after Disney, got Marvel. So again, late aughts, it was still just about clinging on. And then, once you kind of, I feel like, post Arkham Asylum, getting into, the following decade, it just seemed to really this doesn't, a bit more of kind of, hesitate to attach too much kind of good sense to this, but it did feel like there was a bit more of like treating the medium with a little bit more, kind of regard in terms of like, no, it's his own medium. Like, let's not have it necessarily just as product that ties in, that can, as it often was, pretty shoddy, kind of stuff that goes into it is not going to be very good, but it's just this product that you want to slap the name of something on the way that you slap it on Pepsi cans or Happy Meals or anything else, what I mean? Like, there was a bit more regard of like, this is a big industry unto itself, it's a separate medium, you kind of, we can make money in that space, we want to make money in that space, but there's other ways to go around that do it.
I think creating shovelware linked to movies, it also became exponentially more expensive. So you couldn't even take that risk, right?
Yeah, the margins that business model were based on probably got kind of eroded out of the model by the time, in that HD, generation, PS3, 360 onwards, it just, got harder to make that model even work anymore.
Yeah, so what you started to see was everything was either Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, stuff like that, like the known franchises, and so these smaller movies, even though they may have had a good reception, nobody's taking a chance making a game tied to it because
and then eventually even the big stuff seemed to struggle to get those kinds of tie-ins again, because like you said, I mean, stuff like Star Wars, I mean, obviously the prequels had like a million different tie-ins with stuff, but then when the sequels come out like 10 years later or whatever, it's very different, isn't it? It's you haven't got like, oh, here's a GBA Revenge of the Sith game, or, you know, like all this kind of stuff. Obviously GBA doesn't exist anymore, but you know what I mean? It just like, it's so different at that point that even one of the biggest franchises, you don't tend to get those very like direct tie-ins. There've still be, obviously, you know, there's plenty of Star Wars video games and plenty of money to be made in that space, and the Lego Star Wars and all these kinds of, Fallen Order, all the games that have been talked about. But it just, that idea of, like I said, it just feels like there's a corporate spreadsheet somewhere where video games used to be in the same category as Happy Meals, and you know, like, and it just, at some point it got upgraded out of that, if nothing else.
Well, if just because, like there's been a loss of. To a certain extent, the loss of platforms that they could be on, you know, like as you said, the GBA is not really around anymore, but neither is any kind of dedicated Nintendo handheld. That stuff would have moved to iOS, I suppose, at a certain point. But even now,
those do still exist. Like there are iOS games that are out there.
But for the big AAA stuff, of course, like they take longer and longer and longer to produce, and so you're just not going to see that. And I guess even you don't really see like mid-range games anymore of any kind. So like you can't even slot those, you know, movie tie-ins to in that category. So yeah, like there's just no space for them on consoles, it seems, anymore.
There's the odd exception one could think of. I think it brought up Way Forward or earlier on. They had that Mummy Demastered game, which was a very conscious throwback to the era where films would get those sorts of tie-in games, and it was a pixel art retro game, somewhat with a little bit of a somewhere between like a Contra game and a Metroid style game, that was tying into the Tom Cruise Mummy movie, which was of course a pretty big disaster for Universal because it was meant to launch a everything's tied together cinematic universe based on their old monster movies, but it apparently did so poorly that was, even though they must have paid a lot of people a lot of money already up front to do nothing in the end. It's it maybe just shows you it's kind of appropriate in a way that exception was tied to something that went nowhere, because it just kind of validated the feeling that it was very much going against the grain. But they're perfectly enjoyable game, I would say. Not outstanding, but it was quite good.
So I'm trying to think, like we talk about the golden age television. It's kind of a rough factor. Like there.
Yeah, if we're going far back enough that we're talking about like The Sopranos, I mean that did have a video game, right? It was something like Road to Respect or something. I did not play this, but I feel like it was around the same time that it's like GTA 3 obviously blew the hell up, in the early aughts, and so there was this feeling of like, well, GTA is like, Scorsese fan fiction. So why don't we do like actual gangster stuff? So we had the Godfather game, we had Scarface, and Sopranos, I guess, kind of followed suit. Although it's just like the whole thing about Sopranos is that it's avowedly uncinematic. Like that is one of its primary sort of features. Right. So I do wonder how well that turned out.
Well, it was made by THQ, so that should answer that question in all the detail you possibly need. It is based around Big Pussy's illegitimate son as he works his way up the crime family. Bad. The answer is bad. It's, I'm looking at screenshots. It looks so bad. Holy shit. In an interview with MTV around the time of the game release, Chase insisted that Road to Respect had little to no connection to the show. Great way to promote it. Quote, "It wasn't my idea to do a game. What I didn't want to have happen was that the game and the show bleed together. That any of the stuff in the show's story arcs was in the game or had anything to do with the game." Jesus Christ. Well, we wanted to make sure this game fucking sucked, bruh. HBO released a documentary behind the scenes on the making of the game. Why?
Anyway, at least we have the ability to live our power fantasy of having debilitating anxiety attacks.
Yeah, well, given that it's Pussy's kid, we don't know that Puss had any kind of history of mental illness in his family, but
but if you don't have to check in with your therapist, like is this really a Sopranos game? I would argue it's not.
This is the point, isn't it? I would imagine if they had, based on what James said, if they had actually tried to do something that was more representative of the Sopranos experience, David Chase apparently would have come round and hacked off their hands to make sure that it didn't happen.
But the thing is, like, I actually find the idea of being a foot soldier in the mob to be not particularly appealing because that job sucks.
Again, and I mean, in particular, that again, it's so not cinematic. You know what I mean? Like Scarface, you know that's a fucking fairy tale. Like, you know what I mean? Like that, it's not. It's absurd. It's a cartoon of a film, really. It was an entertaining one, but you know, it's perfect for kind of riffing off in a video game setting, and why the GTA games take so much from it, and then it was a natural thing to we'll just kind of do it for real, and somebody did with a Scarface game. Whereas I think with Sopranos, it's so mundane. That's the point. It's it really is like the most up yours to the idea of TV or any kind of scripted medium being escapist you could possibly have. You know what I mean?
Visit all the most glamorous little tables in front of butcher shops. Broker big deals.
It's your peppers and eggs or whatever. It's just so mundane.
Not only is it unglamorous, like the whole point is Tony's family is so fucking small time.
Yeah.
Compared to the operations that are just across the fucking state line. Like they are smallest fucking fish that only exist because the New York families don't care. So you're playing somebody at the bottom of that? No, that's not a power fantasy.
So this is the point, isn't it? It goes to show that Sopranos goes back far enough that even when it's entirely unsuited to
right.
It still got it because this was still the age where it was almost like obligatory, almost like some sort of reflex. Or if a property had enough renown in general, whether it's suitable or not. Oh well, we should do that. Other people are doing it or whatever. But yeah, so I guess like I say, if we say that I'm not up on what general discourse considers to be like the beginning or the middle of the golden age of television, but
like there are people who say it ends with the 2015s when a lot of those shows, like a lot of the FX shows and the AMC shows, wrapped up. There are people who say it's still, like, you would be hard pressed to say that something like Shogun doesn't belong in that terminology. Yeah, yes, there are other things being made, and streaming services have absorbed a lot of these things, and also they've cut back on their budget, and you've got streaming services essentially falling away. I mean, you could argue, I would think you're insane, that Yellowstone is a high-budget, prestige-produced show, which it is, but also it's dumb as shit. That first episode, it's like a bunch of kids going up to their dad and going, "Dad, I killed somebody," and then them hiding the body. The first episode's like 3 times of that. It's amazing. It's a terrible show, though. Don't watch it. But there is something like deeply... Like, I think always people are going to say, like, we're not in the golden age anymore. Just because there isn't the shiny thing directly in front of them at that moment in time. They're always reflecting. But, like, The Bear just dropped a season. That show is highly regarded. Well, maybe FX is still in the golden age. Maybe that's the answer. FX is still fine. Everybody else, fuck, I don't know. But there actually was a potential to do something good with, like The Sopranos. But I don't think it should have been an action game because the show wasn't particularly actiony. Like, action happens occasionally.
But yeah, again, it's very, we're not going to get, somebody at the top of the stairs say hello to my little friend, it's
But what if we did? I think the answer is really more like a game where it's just talking. Like almost one of those, old Telltale games.
Tactical RPG. Sopranos tactical RPG.
Sure, but like a business simulator. But like I think the idea of just like, all right, you're actually Tony, and you have to talk. Like you have things you have to do.
Sort of like Risk, almost.
Well, I wasn't going that far. I was thinking more like people come to you with issues, and you have to talk through it. People like maybe Tony has to talk to one of the actual mafia families and make sure they don't get fucking steamrolled. So he has to be strong enough, but obsequious enough that he doesn't piss them off. Like there's just a certain amount of interpersonal balancing that you could do there. I mean, again, that's kind of like in that Telltale space.
Yeah, that's pretty much like it would feel like a natural enough, like for a lot of these shows around that time would be, just kind of managing relationships and power dynamics and making choices, and then ostensibly they're meant to make an impact, but how much they actually do, I don't know. But
funnily enough, Game of Thrones had a game that came out based on the books, and it was fucking terrible. It's like an action game. It's the worst, but go look at it because it's very funny. But Telltale released a set of Game of Thrones where they picked a house that's kind of out on the periphery.
Yeah.
Like they're an underhouse of I think of the Starks. And it's essentially that. You play as members of the house where they basically are on the brink of financial ruin. They are worried they're going to have what little tender they have taken from them. And you play as various members of the family who are sent off to try to, politically restabilize things. And you're only, like, it's not like you're going to go find stuff and detective mode like the Batman ones. Your really only job is you're surrounded by people who are more powerful than you. Talk to them in a way that makes them want to support your family and try to figure out the problems they're having in front of them. And actually, those games were pretty good. It did a nice job of fitting into the canon that existed, but being an extension of it. And like, I always felt like the best tie-in games were that. They weren't just like, it's just we're going to try to reference the plot of the game as best we can in the confines of whatever the hardware could do. Where, like the Back to the Future games, where it's just a bunch of action stages, more or less. The Star Wars games are actually a better example. Super Star Wars, where it's just like a bunch of action sequences that are broadly themed around the scenes of the games. Whereas if you did something
themed, but not necessarily at all faithful, isn't it? I'm sure we've mentioned before. Like, if you've only ever played Super Star Wars, you're going to be, when everybody talks about the cantina scene, you're going to be, oh, that's a bloodbath. I mean, I just walked in there with Chewbacca and shot everything to death, including a giant version of one of the holographic chess pieces. It's pretty fast. It's not like Scorpion Darth Vader from the Namco game or whatever, but it's pretty all over the place.
So there is a value to just like, hey, if you set it in the universe of the property, but on the outside, you can play with it a little bit more. You can have characters meet. You can have your characters meet the characters from the core content, but also that means you don't have to pay as much for celebrity voice acting. Just a hint. But there is like real prospect there for storytelling outside the core canon that allows you to sort of tie it back together. And so if we're talking about like what like golden era properties, or I guess we could go with film because he mentions a bunch of film too. Things you could produce. I mean, there already was a Dune game. It was a strategy game. It was one of the original RTSs, and it's actually pretty good. If I was tasked with making a game based on the Dune movies, I would just make that again. Because that was really just
off the back of the literature, right? I mean, because it was too far removed from the Lynch movie, and it didn't really, it was like it was trying to tie into that at all. So,
no,
but obviously it was a enduringly popular book, so it's just they've been fair game for kind of decades.
But that's a solved problem, so I'm not going to go try to resolve the problem. Now, does that mean you're going to sell a lot of copies? No, it's an RTS, but like you just need to set your expectations accordingly. I'm trying to think like what are like the big prestige films of the last.
For me, I'm thinking you got to do. I think we need to get Capcom Now that they have reached the point of being able of pretty much assembling all the Ace Attorney stuff, being available to Western audiences, it's time to move on and for them to do Better Call Saul.
Oh boy, I don't know that he's prepared for like that. Like I know they've had basically people being hijacked by the ghosts of of murderers to do murder, but I really feel like Better Call Saul is too weird for them. I feel like there's just too much uncertainty. I'm trying to think like what were like the best picture nominees for the last 10 years. I'm pulling up that list right now because I want to see like what are the options we have to play with. Actually, I should look for the most successful films. 20, let's say the 2020s. Highest grossing movie of the 2020s worldwide. Perfect. Avatar: The Way of Water. So the original Avatar, we've talked about it. It had a game.
Yep.
And we were held hostage at the Ubisoft press event while James Cameron talked about it, with not a single image to be seen. I reviewed that game on Wii. It's half the game it was on the 360 because they just didn't have the human mode in it. It's just the part where you play as the Pandorans. That's it. That's all you get. Spider-Man: No Way Home. We already know how to make a Spider-Man game, but unfortunately that license tied up. Top Gun: Maverick. All right, that seems pretty obvious. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ace Combat 7 just came out on Switch like today.
Yeah, and it seems to be the product of sorcery in terms of how good it looks. Ace Combat games always look good, but yeah, like you could absolutely, like they basically are Top Gun plots. They're dumber than Top Gun plots. They're Metal Gear Top Gun plots. They're so stupid. They are Metal Gear Solid plots in Top Gun gameplay. You should go play them. They're insane. Barbie. What would a Barbie game be?
Well, we've seen several Barbie games.
Let me rephrase that. Barbie, the movie game. I feel like it goes back to that whole relationship thing because the whole premise of the movie is the Kens decide to take over, and they actually set up a pretty good society. If I'm being honest, their society actually I feel like was better, but that's fine. Mario Brothers movie, you can't make a game about that. Inside Out 2, mascot platformer, I don't know. Jurassic World Dominion. There's been a bunch of Jurassic World and Jurassic Park things. I mean, I do feel like the Jurassic Park SimCity style park builder, but it really, really needs to constantly throw just unwinnable scenarios at you. Like, it can't just be... It basically has to be unwinnable. The whole idea has to be that, like, no matter how good a job you do designing this park, putting the security infrastructure in place, building up all the fences, like, ultimately, it has to go wrong. It has to. You can't have it not go wrong. So...
Well, I don't know if Newman's face from Seinfeld is just going to appear on the screen and go and you can't do it anymore. You can't interact with the game anymore.
There's got to be a failure. There has to be, because like imagine Jurassic Park, but the gates held. It's a really fucking boring movie. So the gates have to fail. So how do you make the gates fail? And then, like, what do you do? Like, how do you recover from it? I don't know. Oppenheimer, I don't think I want to think about an Oppenheimer game.
Well, just like, just usually the move for a game like that would just go with, like, pipe dreams. Just, like, turn it into, like, a mid puzzle game where you just rotate little tiles to make something grow through. So you're just trying to guide the atom to, where it needs to go.
I'm picturing a reskin Tetris sphere.
Basically, yes, also. That could also work. That would be great.
I'm skipping through a bunch of Marvel movies. No Time to Die. Yeah, did we get any Daniel Craig Bond games?
Yeah, well, we got GoldenEye. That's a Daniel Craig Bond game.
Daniel Craig in GoldenEye. We did get
that's
that. That's
true. Yeah, you're right. We know how
there
to
was
solve
like
that
this
problem.
weird like 007 game that was kind of I think a multiplayer game where you could be any of the James Bonds? Am I making that up? 007 Legends or something?
That sounds great.
It was bad. Everyone was disappointed, but not surprised.
I like the idea, though, of a Bond game where you actually have to be stealthy. But then again, Bond's never stealthy. Like, everybody knows who he is. Like, what's your name? James Bond? Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, it was 007 Legends.
Everything or Nothing on the GameCube was great. Everything or Nothing was like with Pierce Brosnan, but you were meant to sneak around, but if you couldn't, you could also throw like wrenches at henchmen and beat them up with your fist or take a gun and shoot them down. It was pretty great.
I like the idea of a game where like you actually have to do stealth. And yeah, you can shoot your way out of, well, we have it. It's the Hitman series. Like, you could take the Hitman engine and make a Bond game. Now, it would have to be significantly less goofy because the Hitman games are very goofy by design. Like, it's not an accident. The games don't turn up goofy by mistake. They are goofy on purpose.
Although, I mean, there's plenty of goofiness in Bond history, but if he was doing something that's representative of the Craig movies, I guess not so much. But I mean, who knows what the next Bond's going to be like? Maybe we're due like for the Bond cycle or whatever. It's kind of like the Sonic cycle. So I don't know.
Are we back to Roger Moore?
It's because it's all been a bit po-faced, hasn't it? It's like, what we need to get back to is him fighting enormous people with metal teeth and all that sort of stuff.
So are we abandoning the idea of using TV shows? Because I had one.
Well, no, I was just going through, I wanted to go through like the top films of this decade, just to see if there's something that jumped out at me, and I think I have it. So, Meg 2 The Trench. Why is there not a Meg 2 The Trench game? People fucking love Shark Week. People love Shark Week. John, Shark Week's going on right now. You know who's the host this year?
Mario Lopez?
No, but way better than that.
That's a pretty good guess, though.
John fucking Cena, son.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah. I guess he's doing all that stuff now. Recently
announced retiree. Like Shark Week has prestige. You tell me we can't... And you know who else has prestige? Jason Statham.
Mm-hmm.
He has prestige.
Absolutely. Very much so.
So, like, why is there not a Meg 2 The Trench game? I'm like, it's a big fucking shark.
It's an excellent question.
You could put stages inside the shark because the shark is literally big enough that you can walk inside its mouth. It has the tagline, "New Meg, old chum." Like, fucking let's go. The trailer has a this is a shark. I want to be clear. This is a shark the size of a blue whale. So put that in context. There is a scene of it where Jason Statham is holding back its mouth with his foot. Again, this is a shark the size of a blue whale, and Jason Statham with one foot is keeping the shark at bay.
He's done a lot of kicking in these films, though. So I mean,
he has done a lot of kicking.
It's a powerful foot at this point. The experience points that he's put into that foot are not to be ignored. I would suggest.
I want Meg 2 The Trench in the hands of, let's just say, the Disaster Report team, because I don't want the game to be good.
I'm thinking. Well, the thing is, you can't have multiple games of this because of a film of this import, but I think you do the similar thing the Way Forward did with Mummy Demastered, right? Where you can patterning it on, if it had been, in the old days and you had an old school license, but this time you pattern it on LJN Jaws. Don't you? That's it, because everybody loved that, and then you just but it's like it's a way bigger shark, as you mentioned. It's a bigger shark. It's prehistoric or whatever. So I mean, that immediately makes it better than LJN Jaws. And at that point, I mean, how much better could it even get?
I like that the storyline is just literally the copy. Like, this is clearly put in here by Jason Statham's PR manager. It's amazing. They go. But all right, so Statham's character in 2018 encountered the Meg, and they're like, "Wow, that was bad. We barely survived." And apparently, the plot of this one is he and a famous Chinese actor, so they could release this movie in China, went on an expedition dive into the deepest ocean. What the fuck, man? This is the Taken problem, except it's instead of you're running out of family members to get kidnapped, are you really bad at this? It's, boy, Jason, you seem to really love being inside large sharks. Like, how many times Could you make a Meg 3? Could you make a Meg 3 where it's like, he's back again and he's going deep into the water a third time? No, fuck that. That's stupid. What if it's just your Jason Statham psychologist and you're trying to talk him out of doing another dive? That's the Meg game. Like, then it's side content. It's like, he's gone. Like, you have your sessions with him, and then on the days when he's not there, you're like doing research. You're trying to come up with ways to convince him this is a bad idea. You're trying to diagnose whatever the undiagnosed mental condition Jason Statham's character has, because you have to have one to dive into the deep waters after you've encountered the Meg once. And like, your job is to keep him from getting back in the water before the Meg 3 comes out. And you can actually tie it to the release of Meg 3. So if you can convince him in real time before the game comes out, you win. But that means you have to buy the game soon so you have more time. But don't push him too hard or he'll leave.
You don't have to make Meg 3 about another giant shark. You know, you could go like with take the Halloween, the season of the witch route, do something completely different, but with the same
Make it about
theme.
Meg Ryan?
Exactly, a monstrous Meg Ryan just attacks the city.
The size of a blue whale.
Just a very large Meg Ryan.
Yep.
Yes.
I like Meg 3 is just it's just regular Meg Ryan, and she's very interested in meeting this guy who's fought the Meg, and they just go on some dates.
It would have to be older Meg Ryan though, after the plastic surgery. So she's
Absolutely.
extra scary looking.
She gets into like a transporter accident with the giant shark, and she turns into the Meg.
I was just thinking it's about Meg. Like the credits would say Meg Ryan as herself. She's just walking around like, and she's like, I'm gonna go meet this shark guy. I'm a famous actress. I should be able to do that. Maybe she's researching a movie where she's been stunt cast in it because it's about the Meg. It's the Austin Powers thing. They're making a movie about Jason Statham's actions in the movie with Jason Statham in it. And she's one of the actors and needs to meet him for research that she was stunt cast because she's Meg Ryan and it's about the Meg. There, we did it. We've made Meg 3 and then the actual game is just them going on awkward dates. And Jason Statham telling her about large shark teeth. We did it. That's the best. That's it. We've saved both cinema, as we are constantly being told is dying, and video games, as we are constantly being told is dying, at the same time with Meg 3, Meg Ryan.
Jason Statham explaining to Meg Ryan why humans and sharks can't be just friends. And while Meg Ryan just makes uncomfortably, loud shark noises at the restaurant.
So why did you get back in the water? Because it's there. Like, that's gonna be his answer. It's gonna be their. Wait, I'm reading. Their voyage spirals into chaos when, quote, a malevolent mining operation. What the fuck?
That's kind of all mining operations, to be honest.
What makes a mining operation particularly malevolent? Oh my god. Like, is that any worse than our idea of Meg Ryan's stunt cast as the Meg? Like, maybe Meg 3 ends with an actual Meg eating the set where they're filming the movie about Statham's character, and then he has to go deal with it, and then they just release that as a documentary instead. Done.
Kind of. I think that's pretty close to the premise of Scream 3 as well, isn't it? The whole, they're making a movie of, what the previous movies, and then, you get people asking questions and of like, well, how to play that person in the movie within the movie and all that. Yeah, so it's been done, but why not do it again? It works.
Why not do it again with Meg Ryan? This is a crucial part of the plot. It's the beam that holds up all the ceilings here.
And then if Meg Ryan's unavailable, what are we doing after that, Meg from Family Guy? Is it going to be like...
Movies cancel it, but trust me, she's available. Guillaume, you said you had an idea?
Yeah, TV on it.
Sounds pretty tame at this point, but so I'm currently watching, I just finished the second season of The Righteous Gemstones. I feel like you could make a good, like, The Sims kind of thing here. Where it's just trying to manage this dysfunctional family, but also trying to build your empire. And so, like you're trying to add to, more, I don't know, rights to your theme park, your religious theme park or whatever, while also keeping Kelvin busy, like, you know, giving him enough of a budget to kind of stay in his corner, but like always keep an eye on him so that he doesn't, I don't know, build up an army of strong men and send them to the desert or something.
Periodic Rhythm Heaven style mini games with Baby Billy karaoke or whatever.
There we go.
Yeah.
There was a game called, I think it was called Evil Genius, where you were, as the name would imply, like a mad scientist who had a base, and it was a base building game where you had to build a base and staff it with minions and traps and stuff to keep basically James Bond characters who would periodically try to raid your base to keep them at bay. But also you had to send out agents to go do evil.
Right, so that's the thing. I feel like you could have, like, you could pick characters, from the show to create squads to go on missions.
Yes.
But ultimately, like, the thing here is that they always fuck up. Like, they can't actually succeed the missions. So you always get some sort of, like, random outcome that affects the rest of your gameplay from then on. Like, you have to deal with, like, crazy shit that happened during that mission that you sent them on.
So, like, you can build your mega church and, like, make additions because those additions will generate more money. But also, you need to make sure your fail children don't blow it up.
Exactly.
It's the human condition, really.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you could very easily, like, I'm using Shogun as an example because I feel like there's a very easy analogs for a lot of things, like, but that would almost certainly be a strategy game, and I feel like that's a bad mash for that because that's not really what that is about. It's really just about relationships, and we get back to that whole, like, do you want to make a game where all you do is talk? Because if you don't remember, Telltale went fucking under. There's a limited appetite for games where people just talk. I'm trying to think, like, what would be, like, why did we never get a The Office game? I feel like that existed at a time where that could have happened.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of, not only The Office, but also there's a lot of 80s sitcoms where I'm actually surprised they didn't have games.
I mean, we got a fucking House MD game. We got multiple House MD games.
This is pretty strange.
They were on the DS, and they have some of the craziest fucking sprite sheets in the world. They are on my list of things to use. One, if we ever change the RFN season, like, I might go from WikiHow art to using House MD, because there is some fucking absolutely insane sprites in its sprite sheet. But they did it. Like, was there ever a Law & Order game? It feels like that's a very easy game to make.
Yeah, I'm sure there was.
I mean, that's run for so long. There's got to be something, surely.
Like, that feels very easy.
Definitely a lot of those, like, a lot of cop shows would get, get some sort of, it must have been like CSI games.
There's a Telltale Law & Order game.
There are apparently
there's a whole
fuckload of Law & Order games. There is also a Law & Order Monopoly game, apparently, which is very funny. Starsky and Hutch, the movie, got a fucking PS2 game, for fuck's sake.
Wow.
Like, come on.
Yeah.
We can do better. Like, I'm trying to think, what TV shows came out in, let's say, the last 15 years that could have done with a game? Besides, like, some real fucked up. I mean, yeah, obviously you could just go with a Mad Men game, but again, that's just going to be talking to people and fucked up shit.
Mm-hmm. You gotta actually make the campaigns. You gotta actually draw the posters, come up with the slogans
there we go.
How to keep selling people Lucky Strike cigarettes. That's some escapist fare that people could get into.
I'm trying to think, like, what. It's weird. I can't think of what were the big shows of the last 20 years.
Well, I mean, Sopranos, The Wire, Game of Thrones, Breaking Bad.
God, the Wire game would be rough.
Yeah, we've talked about The Wire.
Yeah, you could make that really dark. I've never watched The Wire. That's one of those ones I need to watch.
incredible, but it took me quite a few years to get around to it, but it was well worth watching, to say the least. But again, much like Sopranos, it's even more so than Sopranos, I would say. There is such little about it that's escapist that it does make it not that every video game experience has to be escapist in nature, but by any means, but still, it really doesn't kind of lend itself to any kind of extraction from its home.
Every Wire game would turn into Spec Ops: The Line, pretty much. Yeah.
Spec Ops Baltimore.
Yeah.
It's like, oh God. Actually, Guillaume, your idea for the Righteous Gemstones brought me up to another fail family of what if you were to just do Arrested Development, the game, where your only job is to try to save the Bluth Company, but it's kind of like SimCity, where disasters show up. It just happens to be the disasters are your own family. Well, you could just literally have I don't know. I'm trying to think who would be like Tobias show up and do the infamous he blew himself scene, where now you have to just it's not actually hurting anything, whatever. But it's just distracting you from what you're trying to do. It's just a constant disruption. Less like, hey, we did something bad, and more just like we did something very stupid. But then you could get into oh, actually, they also did a big crime, and now I have to deal with the fact they did a big they built houses for Saddam Hussein. Great. How do I deal with this mess? There's definitely something there with just you've got a lot of characters that you can do stuff with that are interesting and fun to play with. And I think that's, if you're making a TV-based game, that's probably a big factor in it, because the gameplay probably doesn't matter as much as it does giving you the authentic experience of the show. And I would imagine in most cases, people hang on shows because of the characters, not so much because of the bones of the show, if that makes sense. But we talked about Law and Order, and they've changed casts a million times, so maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe there is some degree of the bones of the show matter too. And but
the formula, I think it's the formula of the show more than anything. Probably more so than even the characters, right?
All right.
Why was the A-Team popular? Because you knew at 15 minutes to the hour, they were going to start building some ridiculous contraption, and then they were going to start punching people.
All right.
It was the same formula. It was the same Stephen J. Cannell formula every single episode.
I've got one for you here. All right. It is essentially GTA 3D format, but you play as a police officer.
All right.
It's set in Reno, Nevada.
Okay.
And it's just Reno 911.
Yeah.
It's just but all of the low stakes of the crime in that show. Mm-hmm. Except occasionally when actual crime happened and no one was equipped to handle it.
Yep.
Just the idea of everything goes wrong all the time is great. That's really fun. And I think more interactive media should embrace everything's going wrong all the time. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not being able to handle the mess in front of me, because I can't handle the mess in front of my own life. So why would I want to see an idealized situation, but they can handle it? No, I want to see heroes that can't handle it. I want to see heroes that fuck it up. I don't want a Band of Brothers game. That's going to be really fucking depressing. I want a game where shit goes wrong. I want a game where everybody has a bad time, except me, because I'm laughing at them. God, a Band of Brothers game would be dark. That actually would be Spec Ops: The Line.
Yeah, it would be Spec Ops: The Line. Yeah, Band of Brothers is... Well, actually, I mean, the Pacific is actually more grim. The Pacific is just grim. It's like you watch it and you're like, yeah, the Pacific was horrible.
It's like, wow.
Forget it. Yeah. It's like there's no, I'm going to Paris for some R&R away from the front. It's like, no, you're in the middle of a coral. You're in the middle of the Pacific on an island made of coral. Enjoy.
Yes. You can't dig into it because, again, it's made of fucking coral.
Yep.
Oh, and they've mined into the caves. Have fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks. No, that's not. No, that's not for me.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, your enemy has been told to fight to the death. So, yeah. So,
yeah.
There you go. There you go. So get your flamethrowers out, boys.
I'm trying to think, what that would.
Masters of the Air, actually, that just came out, which was kind of sold as a similar to Banner Brothers and the Pacific. You could make a good game out of that. Definitely. Like bombing runs, because I was all, bombing Germany and stuff like that. So, that hasn't been done before.
B-17 bomber.
Yeah.
With the voice pack. Well, then it was B-17 bomber.
Yeah. But I feel, what's funny though, is I feel like war games have almost kind of, like they used to be really big in the 80s, I feel like. But, with some of the more prominent games being like, I just think of like stuff like Ace of Aces and stuff like that. And, there's a lot of games like that. But I feel like war games have almost become this kind of weird subgenre now. Like there's more war games out there than you think, but they're not mainstream anymore.
Well, I mean, they are. But
stuff like Call of Duty, yeah. But first-person shooter war games are mainstream, but other types of war games are just not.
The strategy genre had a real fallback.
Yeah. I mean, hell, what am I really saying? I mean, every video game is a war game, sort of, but there's so many. But I just feel like there used to be sort of there's kind of like there used to be, I feel like, an intelligence around war games that is kind of lacking now, and it's just it's all action games, and anything that's not Call of Duty or Call of Duty-ish is sort of like off to the side, or it's like World of Battleships or Warships or something,
Yeah, places where you can post classified documents. Yes,
right, exactly.
Was it Call of Duty that did World War I?
Yeah, Call of Duty's done World War I. Well, Battlefield did as well. Battlefield did.
Yeah. The one that came out not that long ago, because it was on EA Play.
Yep.
I really liked that one, but they really had to pick their theaters so that it could play like an action game.
Yep.
Because guess what's not in there? The fucking Psalm. Why? Because not much fucking happens. Except a lot of people die.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, well, that's not great. So they picked moments where there's kinetic action. And it's wrong to think that war was just stationary, because it wasn't. But for a lot of people, it was. I feel like if it was 10 years ago, the boys would have had a game.
Yeah.
Even if it would have just been like a fighting game cash-in, it would have had something.
Well, I mean, in the NES era, there were games for everything. Because the games were so easy to produce.
What about that shitty Apple TV show, C, where everybody's blind for some reason? Like, what if they just made that game and it wouldn't have to have any graphics because everybody's blind?
Just a black screen.
Yeah, I solved it. The budget's so low. It's so low.
It's just audio. It's just really good audio.
Yeah, we did it, boys. We solved it. Also, fuck that show. So bad. So stupid. But yeah, you're right. Like in the 80s, where it was cheap to make an NES game, and honestly, they didn't really put a ton of effort into making it fit. They just sort of made a game that was good enough and put the license on it and called it a day.
And if we were lucky, they got a really good likeness of the actors on there. In 8 bits. A really good representation, 16-bit representation of John Goodman as Fred Flintstone.
Yeah.
The Lethal Weapon game where you get Mel Gibson, you get Danny Glover, but except that they jump really, really weird. And you get the voice of Danny Glover saying, "I'm too old for this." And that's where it stops. But for some reason, they can't get the voice of Mel Gibson, so you get, I guess Joe Pesci's character in one of the sequels going "Hey, Mo!" And it's inexplicable, but that's what they put in the game.
So now I'm running out of... I'm in that weird mix of, I've got a million ideas, like a Succession business management game. But they're all yeah, well, that's a little too easy. That's just a little... But, if you want... What I talked about earlier, where it's it'd be better if you're not in the core plot. What if it was you're a competitor of theirs, and you're just watching them implode? I feel like that would be more fun than actually being in the implosion. And Westworld's already a video game, so that doesn't get you anywhere. Fargo the game. There we go. Now we're somewhere. All right. We need to move on. Did we answer all the parts of the email? I think we did.
Sure.
Good enough. Guillaume, would you read the next email?
All right. One writes, "Howdy, my dear video game lunatics. If you were in charge of Konami and wanted to revive the Castlevania franchise in a similar manner to how Konami did with Momotaro Dentetsu, how would you do it? What kind of game would you make? What approach would you follow to market the series? Would you follow the canon of the animated series, the original canon, the IGA canon, the Lords of Shadow canon, or something new? We've seen how Kojima's idea to redesign a Western-developed Lords of Shadow into a Castlevania series with different mythos did not work in the long run for the series, and that has essentially killed the franchise, since there isn't now a producer at Konami interested in the series after Iga left. Yeah, that's what... Okay, the Iga canon. Now I get it. I'm sorry. Where was I? Alright,
I don't know.
So no producer killed the franchise since there isn't now a producer at Konami interested in the series after Iga left outside pachinko or mobile games. We've seen Konami fail various attempts at revitalizing Contra, while at the same time, somehow, they were successful with Bomberman. It seems the company will be successful in relaunching MGS World Delta, and I hope they eventually are able to compete again in soccer games with the once superior Pro Evolution Soccer series. But, being a fan of pre-Iga Castlevanias, I'd like to see the series once again being at the top, like Momotaro Dentetsu, or at the very least, being as successful as Capcom's Mega Man. Cheerio. And in parenthesis, also Goemon.
Yeah, we got a different email about Goemon.
Separate email,
from one.
From
yeah,
one,
but the same premise.
But yeah, with a similar sort of outline of what could be done to bring it back. I mean, with Castlevania, it's really quite odd, isn't it? Because it's one of these things that they're quite happy to kind of acknowledge and license out for, you know, Netflix series and the Dead Cells crossover, but. Yeah, maybe this is a little bit of overlap with the question that we had a while back about Chrono Trigger, in that it's like important enough for them to kind of, you know, acknowledge in some way, you know, but it's sort of, it's in this sour spot, you know what I mean? Like it's to the point that they would like to do something, but it's not like it's some sort of commercial imperative. So they're just kind of waiting to find the right thing to do with it, maybe. And in the meantime, they'll just like license it out because, yeah, obviously there was an allusion made to the Contra example where, you know, you just had the recent, Operation Galuga, which is kind of like, you know, the option of like, okay, let's go back to basics, kind of go back to the beginning, but it's not explicitly, you know, tied into like any of the previous games. It's just kind of riffing on them and trying to start something anew. I kind of feel like that might be the way they go one day with Castlevania, but I mean, I don't know how successful, you know, Contra was in that for them. I mean, because a lot of what I've heard about Contra is just that it doesn't play very well on Switch, which, you know, is it's not ideal, to be honest, because I mean, especially the way that it was quite significantly marketed, like in a Nintendo Direct at first, you might have hoped that would be one of the places where it could do best, and then you have a suboptimal version, you know, for that platform. It probably isn't helping its prospects overall, but it might be perfectly fine, you know, if you're playing it on one of the other platforms that doesn't have the same extent of like technical drawbacks or whatever that it does on Switch. But yeah, with Castlevania, yeah, you do have, like I said, maybe a little bit of that paralysis because of just the various options that you do have, as again one alluded to, because there have been a lot of different directions that the series went in over the years, and without somebody, again, this relates to what we talked about with the Chrono Trigger question as well, because we talked about the fact that, you can keep getting like Saga games because Kawazu is there, right? And then, as one points out, there isn't that person to kind of shepherd things at Konami, in the same way for Castlevania or Goemon or, probably a number of things at this point. Obviously, Metal Gear is somewhat in that, department, but they're kind of skirting that a little bit by, Delta being a remake of Metal Gear Solid 3. It's not easy to predict, I think, how they'll sort of take a crack at it one day because of the number of options they've got and all that. But just the fact that they do have kept licensing things out and, kept at least the brand alive, you've got to think they'll do something eventually, right?
Mm-hmm. At some point. I would think. I don't know. It's weird. It's weird watching some of these franchises because it's like Metroid. Metroid was dormant forever to the point where people thought that Nintendo had kind of abandoned it, but then all of a sudden you get a slew of games in a very short period of time, and it just doesn't really make any sense.
I always, at least for Metroid, I always felt like it came down to Nintendo was trying, and they just weren't having success.
Yeah.
And, ideas tend to come in batches. You usually get you'll have a shitload of ideas and sometimes you get a few good ones. And maybe it was just, hey, we had a nice lead up. I mean, it wasn't like we got these Metroid games within a 2-year cycle. That was the early 2000s run where it was just like, here's 8 Metroid games in 4 years. Like we got Metroid on the Metroid 3DS game.
We had Federation Force, and then not long after that was Samus Returns.
Samus Returns, yeah, that was probably about a 2 to 3 year window. Then we had a little gap, and then we had the Switch game, and then we got Metroid Prime remastered, and then allegedly, we're getting Metroid Prime 4 next year. And so, it was, if it was Mario, that cadence wouldn't be shocking at all. My gut is they basically just hey, we found somebody who can make good 2D Metroids. We now have a partner team that we're comfortable working with to do that.
Yeah.
We can start putting a cadence together to make that happen. And the Metroid 3D, Metroid Prime 4 finally got off its ass and is going in the right direction. So we're comfortable releasing something like Metroid Prime Remastered. Because you wouldn't want to release that if Metroid Prime 4 was still in death hell. Mm-hmm. You'd want to at least feel confident that game is moving in the right direction.
Well, there were certainly plenty of suggestions around about the time that it eventually was released, which was very sudden from a public point of view. Just like, oh, here's a Nintendo Direct early in the year. Oh, and it's available right now. But there was seemingly a fair amount of suspicion that the game had been done for quite a while, and perhaps the timing again was related to the notion of getting it closer to when Prime 4 was further down the road, and maybe some notion of building momentum behind that and all that. But that's kind of one of the funny things about the intertwining of Castlevania and Metroid over the years is, of course, the studio that has kind of seemingly helped bring back Metroid, traditional Metroid side-scrolling gameplay to Nintendo platforms was the same people that were doing something that was very untraditional with Castlevania. That, as one already mentioned, the Lords of Shadow games that were really kind of the last word for now with the games.
God, it's been that long.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, because since Lords of Shadow 2, and that was very poorly received. Then, what have they done since then? They've done that sort of Vita, or whatever it was, like the PSP version of, Castlevania X Chronicles or whatever, the Dracula X Chronicles, just up-ported to PS4, and which, apparently has, I don't know, I mean, what kind of deal did they sign there? Did that give Sony exclusive rights over those games in perpetuity or something? Because it still isn't on Switch. Symphony of the Night is not on Switch. Dracula X is not on Switch. You would have thought those games would be very nice kind of additions to this. And of course they have had collections, 2 of them, actually, the Castlevania collection that had the sort of 8 and 16-bit, Castlevanias for the most part, but Game Boy games as well. And then, of course, the Advanced collection with the 3 GBA games plus the weird kind of orphaned edition of the Super Nintendo Dracula X. But yeah, that in itself is just a bizarre wrinkle that for so many years and so many games on Switch that have probably done a tidy bit of business that are completely, indebted to Symphony of the Night creatively. They very much use that formula to their advantage. The one of the real progenitors of it is just missing. It's really unusual. I would have thought like that Sony, kind of doing that, that port or whatever it was exactly of the PSP versions of the Dracula X games onto PS4. Like, why would that preclude anything? It doesn't really make sense. And yet, the fact that it hasn't emerged doesn't make sense. So I just at a loss. And that's one of the additional elements that just makes it hard to predict what they'll do with it. But again, it just feels like, if you have enough regard to do some of this stuff with crossovers and licensing, there has to be some sort of way forward that could be found. But they're just like, not, and you can bet your life, like Mercury Steam, pitching Nintendo on, we could do a Metroid game. Like, there must be numerous developers that have pitched Konami over the years, we could do a Castlevania for you. And they haven't said yes. That can only be the truth of it. And it's interesting, what about those pitches maybe they don't like, or what is it exactly that stays their hand there?
Maybe it's too much like everything else that's out on the market, because I'm sure from a certain degree they're saying to themselves, why would we release, say, something like Symphony of the Night when there's already so many games out there nowadays that effectively ape that concept? What they would probably, like, Nintendo would look at something, Konami would probably say, we need something that is new and different and is going to stand apart from the dozens of Metroidvanias that are released every year.
Yeah, and that's the other issue, is that if they release a Metroidvania, there's no shortage of those. Like, even Nintendo was cognizant of that with the Metroid games that they put out. So maybe it's time. Like, they've made a lot of those over the years, and they've re-released them regularly, with the exception that Greg has noted. Like, maybe it's time to do something else.
And there's still the DS games that haven't really come back.
That's true.
But obviously DS games do provide a little bit of an additional kind of problem, adapting certain things. But it's been done in cases like the ZX games, with the talking about the Mega Man kind of comparison there. So,
in terms of like what kind of gameplay would work well, I think it's kind of a tough call, because we're sort of enshrined to think of, well, Castlevania's got 2 flavors. It's got what essentially is the peak of the form in like Super Castlevania 4. I don't know what the PC Engine one falls into. It's kind of in a weird middle ground.
Yeah, I'd say it's got some exploratory elements, but and things to find, like the extra people to rescue and this, that, and the other, and like branching with the levels. But I'd still say it's, decent amount of continuity, say for instance with Castlevania 3 in that regard and stuff. So, I mean, I think it's part of the kind of what is sometimes referred to as classic Vania, as opposed to the Metroid stuff. So mostly that, and it probably is the best one of those, because it's really very good in that regard.
It's probably not the purest one of those, but from just, this is an enjoyable game to play. It is definitely up there. I would think that you could make one of those, and it would be a brisker game. It'd be a faster game. And you would make it like a 2D side scroller with really, really nice art. And you would just focus on like, how fast can you beat this fucking game? Like, almost like I would even have a time attack mode in it. where it's just like how we are timing your game. How fast can you beat it?
Well, and that's, I mean, I think Inti Creates have kind of, offered, a bit of a playbook for how you could sort of attack some of this stuff, because they've done those, that Bloodstained, of course, being Igarashi's, serial number filed off Castlevania in the Metroid style. But then Inti Creates kind of did a couple with the Curse of the Moon kind of sub-series that were just, okay, we're going to do, in the Bloodstained universe, the kind of pre-Symphony, the classic style games. And they are, really well put together, and they offer a number of ways to kind of expand the replayability of the game with, to kind of different endings and, different modes and so forth. Obviously, it's still not going to be something that's a huge sprawling experience, but, to kind of take something that is at once, has a certain degree of fidelity to those classic experiences, but also is kind of somewhat more forgiving and somewhat more varied and, kind of expansive in its own, kind of contained way. So I think that's probably the intelligent sort of, way to go about if you were going to do a revival of that classic strain of the series. And Inti Creates have got a lot of experience with making such games, coming from like a Mega Man background and all the kind of stuff that they've done since. But yeah, again, it'd be a shock to me if they hadn't like proposed such a thing to Konami at some point and apparently been rebuffed.
Like my thought is, I want it to be 2D, and I want it to be 2D art. I want it to look like a PC Engine game, which I know makes it expensive. But the idea is that like Super Castlevania 4 graphically is sort of the high watermark for the classic Castlevania games. So this is what would have looked like if 2D games never died. I mean, you got like a few in that area, like the X68000 sort of game that came back on PlayStation as Chronicles with the slightly adjusted graphic. I think it's only really just like the sprites for Simon and Dracula. I think pretty much everything else was intact. But again, sort of that advanced sprite art, but still feels rooted in that particular era. That's what I want. Because I feel like you could release the game on a relatively low budget. You could release it for relatively affordable. And I think you could actually create, because it's going to have the Castlevania name, the name has resonance. I think you could actually create enough of a fervor around people streaming it to just go after the time attack, to try to set records on the time. I think there's, especially if you have secrets in there and ways you can sort of fuck around to dodge time. I feel like to save time. I feel like there's value in there that's actually really useful. I just don't know that it's the best way. Like, it's probably not going to be the best game, but it's probably the best ROI they could get on a relatively conservative investment. And if you were asking me to be the person to bring it back, my first priority is keep my fucking job. And I think that's a very fair way to get there for a company that had basically decided they don't want to make video games anymore. No, and now they're back to making video games.
That's the point, isn't it? That it has been something that it's been a bit of a slow process, right? But we're definitely in a better place with Konami actually wanting to capitalize on their video game brands, and not just in video games, but at least that's part of the mix again, rather than just the pachinko machines and the licensing. So there's a somewhat positive direction of travel, but as we said, what's kind of going against it is this kind of hollowing out of the middle of the industry, right? Where it's like those mid-tier sort of projects that you would assume would be the only kind of tier that Castlevania could get sign off on. It's not the amount of money that they're going to spend, I can only assume, remaking Metal Gear Solid 3 is something that is just absolutely unattainable for a Castlevania project of any description. So, you'd be looking at something sort of in that middle tier somewhere, but that's not really like the most popular space, is it? But I'm sure there's a way of making it work. You kind of feel like if you did it, and clearly, the Contra game is an attempt to do that, right? Like that's not some kind of like insanely budgeted thing by any stretch of the imagination, but it's also not just like, okay, let's do like Shovel Knight. And it's basically like an 8-bit looking game either, right? They didn't go that route with it. So, like I said, I kind of feel like that what the strategy they used for Contra is probably the most like plausible one I can think of them using for Castlevania. And I wonder if it was in any way a dry run, even though those, they're not. It's a bit of apples and oranges because they are different series, different histories, different awareness, different gameplay styles. But what the outcome of, if that were true, if there were an element of like, let's see what kind of success you can have with this kind of project and the way you're trying to appeal to people's memories of a series and stuff. I don't know enough about how well it's done in the marketplace more broadly to kind of suggest what they might have taken from that experience.
What if they went further afield and we got a game where you're Dracula? Fuck it.
Well, maybe, you know what I was thinking? Maybe they could do something like Diablo.
Ooh.
Right? Like they could do something of that type. Because there's really not a lot of games of that type out there. The big ones are Diablo and Path of Exile. I can't think of anything else that's really like those two games.
There was another one, but I think that series stopped getting made. I'm blanking on what it was called though.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the idea of there's kind of like what was the name of the vampire something?
Vampire Survivors, right? That got the Contra crossover content.
That's funny.
Like if you just had a top down, you could. It's almost Gauntlet-esque in a weird way. Like, but. Because I feel like they'd probably still want it to be more action-y, but yeah, I get what you're saying. Like, there's definitely space there to do something fun with that franchise.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the problem that they could run into, and I think they've probably looked at it as like, hey, it's been a bunch of different things. Some of the before Lords of Shadow, like you had the Castlevania 64, you had the Igarashi 3D games on PS2 and stuff. Like, it's been an awful lot of things over the years, but. The problem is when you get to this point where post Lords of Shadow, there've been so few games for so long. If you have the attitude of like, well, Castlevania doesn't just have to be one of a couple of different kinds of side scrollers, or it doesn't have to be Lords of Shadow. It can be a lot of things. You could put yourself into a Federation Force kind of trap where. The people who still like Castlevania or still have some investment in it emotionally will react in a hostile manner. And then, you're kind of poisoning the well, from that point. Like, you may have to do something more orthodox and have some kind of modest success with it first before you could get more adventurous with it. That is, that's kind of sad in a way because it's a bit stifling for, for everybody that says, about why are this, that, the other the same all the time, is a rehash, or, well, this is some of the reason why, right? Because sometimes when you get, the prospect of things that are different, it's not taken well by people that are possessive of the way things were.
Yeah, and another direction I could see them taking is like something like I just look at some of these games, and if you look at them, they're sort of like The Witcher 3. Like, what if you did something like that in the Castlevania kind of mythos?
It'd be so expensive, though.
It would be so expensive.
That's the moonshot type of deal, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
You're probably talking about having to work up to that somehow. But goodness knows how long it would take. And it's just. It's, I don't know whether any of the Japanese companies are particularly kind of, probably with the exception of something like the Final Fantasy, 16 and the remakes of 7. It's daunting, I think, for them to even attempt to match up to the scale of games of that sort.
Yeah, and if you look at something, but like I look at some of these games, it's like Final Fantasy 16, for instance. That game is not, I could see that being a Castlevania RPG. Just the way that it plays.
It's a character action game, basically,
yeah,
right?
Exactly, yeah. It's an action game. It's not really an RPG.
And that is very much what Lords of Shadow was trying to do. Yeah, so yeah, that's the thing. And I mean, the funny thing about, you know, Final Fantasy, of course, is you've got an enormous amount of latitude, you know, in terms of, you know, you're not necessarily beholden to a bunch of, you know, story that's, you know, yeah, because each numbered entry, you know, tends to be just its own thing and all that. So, yeah, I don't know how well that's done, you know, relative to their expectations. Because that's the thing, it's when you spend that much time and money on something, it's a high bar, right? Because it's not just about, you know, making the money back that you put into it, which was probably very considerable, but it's also about making enough money that you say we weren't better off doing something else entirely. And you know, that I'm not sure if Final Fantasy 16 has cleared that bar or not, and that's always going to be the problem with something like Castlevania is, you know, couldn't we have just put this into something that was more dependable, that was, you know, that was safer in the first place? And that's, you know, where the fallow period that Konami had, where they didn't really seem to want to do terribly much with a lot of their different properties, has made, like, trying to sort of bring any of them back probably more risky in the minds of, you know, the people that actually have to sign off on this stuff. So
you're saying we're not getting our Alucard dating sim?
Well, I mean, you live in hope, I guess. If I'm just imagining that kind of, they get, is it James Callis? I think he was Dr. Baltar in Battlestar Galactica.
Oh yeah.
Doing his very sleepy, very soothing voice in a dating sim. I wouldn't say no. I'll go there.
Our Dracula management sim, where he has to like, at some point Dracula hired fucking Death to guard his tomb. Like, what if it was like you're interviewing henches as Dracula to protect you while you're asleep? Like there's a game, and how far did the hero get? It's like tower defense, but you don't have any active role in it. Like, you're aware of what's happening, but you can't get involved because you're still in your sarcophagus.
Yeah, I think I was as a child. I mean, you just accepted of these things in general, but I think I was particularly accepting of the weirdness of, like, Death being Dracula's, like, number 2 because of seeing Flash Gordon as a child. Where it's like, okay, well, Dracula's Ming, and Death is Clytus, that guy, you know, with the black robe and the gold skull face. It's like, yeah, oh, it's the same thing. This is just the thing. This is a trope, I guess, you know, of, like, you know, the villains and their number 2s. But it's a lot weirder than I ever actually gave it credit for. Like, okay, so it's like, it's all the people that are in Universal monster movies. And then the Grim Reaper, like, where did that come from? Like, in the minds of the Japanese developers that were making it? Because, like, most of it is pretty much straight out of something, either a Universal movie or the Hammer films that were essentially just updates of those earlier films.
Yeah, like, just Dracula hiring like, your job is to hire people for the castle to protect it.
It is my life as a Dark Lord, but specifically with Castle Dracula.
Yeah, exactly. It's a game. It's a game for all ages, is what I'm saying. Guillaume, you're reviving? I have handed you the keys to Konami. You're now reviving Dracula.
I have the keys to Konami.
Yeah.
Can I just, like, drop them in, like, the little crack, like, in the elevator shaft or something, or a gutter? No.
They sold the elevator.
Damn it. Because I've said before that I when I played Dead Cells, that I didn't care if Castlevania didn't come back ever because I had Dead Cells. I still kind of feel that way, even though I'm not, like, always playing Dead Cells or Dead Cells like. I feel like we've gone around Castlevania, like the whole thing, a lot of times, and I'm not sure. I don't know what you do with it. I have, I guess, no imagination for it. Like, maybe, like, you know, like something that Greg just said about, like, how it's inspired by the Universal monsters. Like, that could be maybe like an avenue that we could take about it. But bring back the stupidity of like the credits with like puns on what's his name,
Christopher
Boris.
B. Fred Astaire. All the
right.
No, that's the thing. It's like that. It doesn't have to be. I mean, the issue is, I guess now. You had Lords of Shadow as the last time, kind of in a game form, and that was very much like, it's more like we could give it more gravitas. We're trying to, we get Patrick Stewart, to do like a bunch of narration and all this stuff, and then of course you've had the animated series, which is kind of, it's an interesting tone. It's definitely not like takes itself super seriously. There's quite a lot of, humor to it, but it's very dark and violent and gory and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it would still be a bit of whiplash, presumably, for people who know Castlevania from those kinds of sources, if you were going to lean into the like, we're referencing creaky old horror movies from, the 30s and the 50s and 60s, like it would be, a bit of whiplash there. But at the same time, maybe that's how you avoid this problem that John already mentioned and Guillaume just mentioned it again there, of this feeling of like, everyone else has kind of eaten your lunch. Like you stepped aside and everybody's filled that space. So you kind of have to maybe attack it a different way at this point to
Dracula cart.
Well, they did YY Racing.
They did.
Or Konami Crazy Racing was the localized name, wasn't it? But yeah, that was kind of an allusion to earlier Konami games on Famicom, where they just basically did a big crossover of all their characters that they'd made games out of, including licensed characters like Mikey from the Goonies, like being in stuff, Castlevania levels and all that. Those games didn't get out of Japan. But yeah, They've made it kind of difficult for themselves, and I guess that's why they're having so much reticence to pull the trigger on anything at this point.
Anybody else? All right, what about Goemon?
Oh, yeah. I'll try and be quick with Goemon because I'm just quite confident I've played the most of the Goemon games of any of us here. Because I played all 4 of the Super Famicom games, one on the Game Boy, one on the DS, the 2 N64 games. And so, yeah, it's pretty obvious that, we talked about this already. Again, with Castlevania, we pretty much would know or strongly suspect that developers have been pitching them on maybe making one for them and getting rebuffed. Well, we have like really living proof of that with Goemon, because the people at Goodfeel, who, were Konami veterans and had worked on, Goemon games specifically over the years, they've made their own non-Goemon game. They've essentially their bloodstained equivalent for Goemon with the Mamida no Bakaru. And you have to think that they started developing that in the hopes that, they could say to Konami, let's bring Goemon back together. You own the rights. We actually made the thing, so let's put the band back together and make this game as, a new Goemon 3D, kind of game. And they said no. and so you have it as, a separate property that Goodfeel have self-published in Japan only. And so, yeah, that, on the one hand, like I said, if you think about it, they must have also done that in many cases for Castlevania, which might still, have a shot at coming back, one would think, one day. The fact that they've done this with Goemon suggests that the scope for it to come back is limited. And that's a shame, because I really do like quite a few of the games, and I just like that whole era of Konami where they just did a bunch of silly stuff. Like that, they're silly games with like stupid, scenarios and like the kind of goofy soundtracks and all that. Like they were really fun. Parodius is another series that had loads of entries. At one point, it's kind of baffling how many of them they were pumping out. But then, once that era of like, pixel art arcade shooters, sort of stopped being viable, that was pretty much the end of it. And there's no real sign of that getting, even just like, collections and stuff, you know what I mean? You haven't even got to that threshold with these sorts of series. So, maybe the most we would hope for would be an NSO type of thing, but just to make it really kind of brief, I guess with Goemon, the best probable way would have been, to just like do a deal with Goodfeel and let Mammoth and Bakaru be a Goemon game. Because I don't know, the thing with Castlevania when they turn down a pitch is somebody else is going to come along with a pitch, later on, and it might be more suitable. You might like it better. Who else is going to come along with the Goemon pitch for the people that actually made them back in the day and give a shit? No one. So, right. When you turn that down, I think you're basically passing on the concept altogether. But, and that is, to me, that's a shame. But Goemon is another series that's been a lot of different things. Top-down games, side-scrolling games, 3D games. There really isn't much like limit to like the specific way you could bring it back. So it's got a bit of flexibility there. And certainly I think Mamoru no Bakaru is quite multimodal, but, yes. There's just not you're not licensing out for anime. You're not doing, partnerships with Dead Cells, all that. It just feels like it's, sadly firmly in the kind of back of the drawer.
Well, that's kind of where I was at of how I was going to revive it, rather than just like, I'm not going to acquiesce to these people who left, or they were probably laid off, but let's say they left and betrayed us by making a knockoff. I'm going to do my own thing. And I would have somebody lay out a high level plot of Goemon, like just whatever. It doesn't have to be that detailed. It's Goemon. Who gives a shit? And write up some high level story sequences that have a plot layout. And then I would just divide it up into 12 levels. And I would go to indie developers in Japan, because I'm going to do this on the cheap, and have each of them make a mini game without any knowledge of what any other team is doing. And I would give them the theme for that stage of the game, and they would just basically game jam out a mini game for me. And it would be, maybe something on the scale of Haggleman from, so I'm picking all the references that so many people have played.
Retro Game Challenge.
Yeah, something relatively small, like, so that you could play them independently as like a score attack thing, and maybe they've got multiple stages of difficulty and stuff like that. But in the context of the single player, you would just play them on level 1, and then maybe if you beat the game, it would wrap around and give you level 2 of everything. And you just like tell them, make it as crazy and silly and ridiculous as you want. But it's just got to be fun, because I don't think Goemon has to be anything. I think you could make 12 completely unrelated minigames that just all share Goemon art assets. And
yeah, I mean, Goemon
get away with
party,
it,
right?
Yeah, basically, but not.
Like, why not? But really, why not? With something that silly, who cares?
They did some pretty weird. There was like some sort of Ibisimaru spin-off at one point. I can't remember what because there were the two games on N64 that I've played, that one of which was essentially a 3D action adventure before Ocarina of Time came out. And then the other was a polygonal side-scrolling platformer. But I believe there was a third game in Japan only that had something to do with Ibisimaru, but the gameplay was just like a puzzle game. I don't know. I can't remember if that was, but yeah, they've been very liberal with it over the years.
Pinball. There, we did it. I think we're all good with.
Yeah, it's anything, any kind of recognition would be something. Maybe you could at least start thinking of it as a stepping stone, a building block towards something else. But I mean, in the meantime, as I've said, more than a few times, I'm sure I certainly say it. Just like if you're not gonna put a collection together, license them out, to NSO at the very least to see, if that generates anything, because it just feels like that's the most logical. We saw it with Castlevania Legends on the Game Boy NSO. Like there's certain games which apparently you feel are not particularly worth monetizing yourself, but there is something else you can do with them.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. It's just like Konami right now is coming from such a land of zero where they were doing nothing, that they've got so many franchises that was always the thing. Like they had all the Hudson franchises and they had their own, and we're doing fuck all. So, like, there's obviously a priority order that they want to restart them. It's like Metal Gear's up there, definitely, and Castlevania's up there. But, like, it would take them a while to get to Goemon, I suspect.
Yeah, that's also a fair point. And just to go back to the original point about the Momotaro Dentetsu, or whatever, I mean, like, that's like, was it they're I think they're on their second million seller in Japan with that sort of revival now. So yeah, that's a pretty remarkable kind of success story there with the Japanese market. But I'm not sure. Castlevania was always bigger outside of Japan. That's, another one of the potentially kind of limiting factors there. Goemon, I would have thought, obviously would be much more like a lot of jokes tied into Japanese history and culture and things. Well, that was always more of a Japanese thing, but I never got the impression it was hugely successful, on the, I mean, I imagine, like the Famicom era probably did quite well because almost everything did. It felt like, stuff like Atlantis no Nazo sold quite a lot of copies and, that was the big boom. But it must have done well enough, to get 4 games on the Super Famicom and to get a couple of games on N64 and then eventually, a DS game even into the aughts and stuff. But it just, it's one of those things where maybe if one of those franchises had a more even kind of global appeal rather than like Castlevania's more for the West and Goemon was just a Japanese thing, kind of makes it a little bit harder, I think.
Fair. All right, we're gonna take a break here. When we come back, I think we've got a little bit of listener mail we want to get through, so go ahead and stay tuned. We are back, and I was originally supposed to say we were going to do new business, but then these guys are like, well, you screwed up, but we're going to do listener mail anyway, and just make this an all listener mail show. So we're going to do one more email, which, again, RFN at NintendoWorldReport.com. I forgot to end the last segment. I'm going to say it again. RFN at, which is a symbol. It has got an A in it with a loop around it. NintendoWorldReport.com. That's .com as in a website. There is a website called NintendoWorldReport.com. You could go there for content, but if you just want to email us, it's RFN at NintendoWorldReport.com. So, just in case that has been lost to the annals of time, because at some point people are going to say email. That's old. Well, whatever. Fuck it.
But do we want to receive their email for,
yes,
at that moment?
Yes, I want to turn to dust.
Email, that's like a baby's toy, or as the kids say in the Cafe 80s in 2015 of Back to the Future 2.
God. All right, so anyway, we got one more email. And who has not read an email? Who would like to read this email?
I can read.
You want to read it?
I can read this email.
John feels confident. I'm going to let John read this email.
Carl writes, "Hello, RFN crew. For the last month or so, I've been playing NES games. Games like Mega Man 2 and 4, Castlevania 1 and 3, Super Mario Bros. 1 and 2, Legend of Zelda, etc. Before I had made a point to stay away from the NES, but now having played it, I can only appreciate the wisdom of my younger self. It's not the modest graphics or the limited tech that bother me so much, but more the incessant and pervasive desire on the developer's part to extract the only resource a child in the 80s would have, time. Punch-Out, though not necessarily a great example, as it in fact has a password system within it, even so demonstrates the vexation of limited continues in its last circuit, and that the more you advance, the more repetitious fights you will be exposed to when you inevitably fail your current one. So really, the more you succeed, the more you are punished. I don't recall all the details of Sisyphus's punishment, but it's akin to his boulder growing in size as he nears the peak. Metroid has similar problems, though oft touted as a game about exploration. The game's principal gameplay loop is health and missile grinding, which if it wasn't already mundane enough, becomes even more arduous as you obtain more missile expansions and enemy tanks. Again, punished for success. What generally baffles me about all of this is that Nintendo themselves seemed to champion games with limited continues even as Konami and Capcom actively moved away from them. Even when they introduced an actual save system in Zelda, they backpedaled with Zelda 2 into a half-save, half-limited continue setup.
I don't want to go on too much longer, so I'll finish off with this. In the Super Mario Bros. Series, the inclusion of the pipes, jars, and whistles demonstrated that Nintendo devs knew the limited continues were lousy, but while those acknowledged the problem, they didn't actually address it. In regards to the ongoing discussion of supremacy between Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World, only one of them includes a basic save feature, so I really don't think there should be too much debate. If you have any NES recommendations that might redeem this system's good name, I'd love to hear them. Otherwise, I think the NES is easily Nintendo's worst console/system, even more so than the N64 and Game Boy. Meaning no disrespect to all of those millennials hopped up on nostalgia and Stockholm Syndrome. Thanks.
I feel like millennials would be too, like, as a millennial.
Yeah, I mean, that's the
I
NES
was kind
is pre-millennial, I would say.
Yeah, like, I was 4 when I got one in 90, so, like,
And,
I mean,
as an elder millennial,
yeah,
I just said that out loud. I never had the NES, but
I wasn't 4.
I don't know. I would have been like 9 or 10 in 1990, so that it fits.
Yeah, for me, it's my first system, but as we touched on last week, like it broke down so early in my life. I was probably about 6 when it stopped working. So while I have some very kind of formative memories of playing the NES, fighting Dracula in Castlevania, fighting Mike Tyson in Punch-Out, it's kind of patchy at the same time, like when your memories that age are not that kind of, especially as old as I am now, like it's very, the Super Nintendo is really the one where it feels like I can distinctly remember the whole time of having it and, playing those games. So that's more my system, if you like, on that basis. The Super Famicom kind of era. But, I think, first of all, it's the old gambit at the end there of meaning no disrespect and then say something that's instantly disrespectful is,
We see through you.
It's like, well, yeah, you know what I mean? It's one of these. It never sits terribly well with me when you sort of say, well, the only reason why someone can hold this opinion is because they're entirely irrational or, subject to some sort of mental illness or disorder or
the disorder that didn't even exist. It was
it's a seemingly apocryphal disorder. Yeah, right. It's not great, but, even though I can see, some of the substance behind it. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, for everyone, the context in which you experience things is important. And that relates to the time you experience it. It relates to your, kind of, development as a person, and your kind of, exposure to the media of the same sort, experiences of the same sort. What have you played before? What have you not played before? All these things factor in, but there is also just a matter of, sort of, personal taste and, the different perspectives that are going to come into it. And I dare say, there must be people who can safely enjoy, 8-bit experiences without benefit of being as old as I am, and ever having kind of interacted with them before. I think that's just, safe to assume based on the sheer number of people, that play video games. Some
video games that are often harder than 8-bit games were.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's different ways of looking at it, isn't it? Because for as much as, the kind of some of these tactics that were discussed by Carl, when you talk about, might be, uncharitable checkpoints or limited lives, limited continues, the kind of health grinding of Metroid, all these kinds of things. In some ways, those games were more accessible than today's games for people who wouldn't have any prior experience with video games because the inputs are so much more simple. It's a D-pad and 2 buttons. Which is something that Nintendo kind of picked up on during the Wii generation, that things had kind of gone so far, really kind of, expecting that people had been playing video games all the way along and they were perfectly content with adding, an extra set of shoulder buttons, an extra analog stick and all this sort of stuff that, that there was a space to go back and say, well, here's a more, kind of streamlined input mechanism, for instance, with the Wii Remote, that, seem to, kind of get a lot of people playing video games either again or for the first time. So, some people may kind of find, that it depends what, are the particular frictions that affect you the most as a player. What do you dislike the most being put in your way with these sorts of things, I think. But also, I would say, some of these things are, kind of, I would, in terms of a recommendation, the way the email ends in terms of particular games, I think one of the things that sticks out to me is not a particular game, but just how you're experiencing them. I mean, because with the case of limited lives and continues and so forth, this is something that you essentially make for yourself with like NSO and save states. Right. I was talking about this just last week with Perfect Dark, just like, well, they probably wouldn't do it like this anymore if they were making the game now. And even back then, it kind of stuck out as a bit kind of, silly, a bit kind of counterintuitive with some of these kind of gotcha moments in a protracted mission. So, I'm just going to kind of say, right, if I meet a mission objective, I'll make a save state there. You can have a similar thing, with these games where it's like, okay, well, you have the example of the final circuit of Punch-Out. And I think it's a fair point, because you may get to a point where you've kind of, mastered might be a bit strong, but, you can beat those earlier fights, right? You know how to beat them. You've learned the patterns well enough to execute the fight properly. But unlike, the early circuits where it's like, okay, once you know how to beat like Glass Joe and Von Kaiser, they're going to go down really fast. They still take time. So like, yeah, I get that. Like, but just make a save state after you've beaten them and then go from, if that is the problem, if it isn't the aesthetic or the core gameplay or all this other stuff, just, say, yeah, well, I've beaten them, so I'm making my own checkpoint. I mean, I know you could say something about a slippery slope of like, oh, well, it's all fallen apart now. All structure has fallen and, you're not getting the kind of enjoyment of the curated challenge anymore. So just stick to your own rules. Make them.
I would say if anything, for these games, it's actually playing these games now is better than ever, because you actually have the options to play the game in any way that you see fit. If you want to have the original experience, you can have the original experience. If you want to save scum it.
Well, and
you couldn't do that before.
Some of these games got fucked up when they came to North America anyway, because they wanted to make them unnecessarily hard.
Yeah.
And look, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it kind of went both ways a bit, didn't it? There was a period where the games would oftentimes be made easier for America because there was this feeling of like, well, the Japanese market was more mature and, they had more experience with video games. They were, because the Famicom came out in 1983, so it could kind of handle it more. But then when the rental thing happened, it's like, oh, no, okay, well, now it's got to be harder for America because it's got to, and again, back to Carl's point about time, we've got to make it last longer than a rental. We cannot lose sales to rentals because people could just beat it in that span of time. So they deliberately put stuff in to slow it down.
But that's also, that comment about time also implies that games these days respect your time or don't go too long. I mean, how many games have you played where you're saying, this game is just wasting my time to pad the experience? There's really not a whole lot of value in what I'm doing. That happens all the time. And even in games like Metroid Dread, that was one of my experiences where I felt like some of that game, some of the more difficult parts of that game were the stuff where, the chase sequences and stuff like that. It was just kind of making that game hard for no reason, or, making the runtime go longer for no reason kind of thing. So I think that doesn't happen now.
There was definitely a little bit of self-consciousness because those experiences don't tend to naturally be that long, right? So if you're doing a sequel to Metroid Fusion, which maybe it is essentially, that's not a terribly long game, is it? Right. And of course, the thing is nowadays, it's coming out for a higher price on a, higher priced bit of hardware. There's like more of a self-consciousness of like, okay, it's got to be a bit longer. We've got to make people feel like it's a kind of a satisfying experience. And there's I think in particular, it's that, for me anyway, that Chozo soldier kind of mini boss. It just, that crops up a few too many times from, without it being particularly different. That just kind of feels like someone at some point felt like, what if we just put this in here again and, made it a little bit harder, and that'll, slow people down? Because there's some great stuff in that. And I think some of the legitimate challenge is actually very, very satisfying. I've talked about the last boss before. I absolutely love the feeling, and this does go back to fighting Dracula and Mike Tyson as a child, of getting to a last boss and absolutely hating its guts because it's actually making you work to take it down. Yes. But some of the other stuff in the middle is definitely like, we're worried that people will think this is too short, and we're going to try and slow them down in a not very sophisticated way. So it's not certainly the province solely of the 8-bit era. That's a very fair point.
So he wants recommendations. Let me give you some weird shit. I feel like what is going to be most appealing to our writer here is going to be things that are effectively pick up and play. Or things that have save in them. And now, Nintendo probably would have put more full-featured saves in most of their games, except that cost money, and the NES format didn't have the disc system.
That's right, yeah.
To take some of the edge off that cost. So writable media was expensive. The Super Nintendo didn't have that problem, and even then, there were still some Super Nintendo games that didn't do saving the same way. Like, Capcom was still fucking putting codes in Mega Man X games. Now, they did have save anyway. I don't know why they put the codes in. They're fucking psychopaths. But, like, you want some, like, Twitch action stuff that you're not going to be all that upset about if you lose it. If you're playing on original hardware, some of the light gun games are amusing. I think trick shooting is pretty fun. But again, the light gun requires you have a CRT TV. It requires you have a light gun. It requires you playing on real hardware. If you're just playing it with a mouse on an emulator, you lose some of the visceralness of it all. I think also the NES had weird stuff like Hatris, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's Tetris with hats. You should give it a try. It's an officially licensed game. It's fucking weird. It's extremely. It's more like Dr. Mario. It's about matching, but you create pillars of hats on people's heads. It's dumb and funny, and I actually think it's an amusing product. I want to say there was another one that came out not that long ago. Boat Duel. That's another one where it's like, this is actually pretty decent. Eliminator Boat Duel. There's just stuff out there that people don't like. People know what the worst games on the NES are because YouTube exists and that's easy content. Don't play those. But there's stuff where it's just like, we had a really silly idea and we went ahead and put it into a game and it's fun. Like, the thing is, there's so much NES stuff.
There is. I mean, there's I just find it funny that he says, "Oh yeah, NES games just waste your time, like Mega Man 2 and 4." Okay, well, stop! Don't play Mega Man games. How's about that?
Mega Man 2 is actually,
but those are some of the hardest games in general on the NES.
2 is tough.
Yeah.
But like,
it's still a pretty breezy game, or at least like. Anyway, like yesterday, like randomly, I was playing the first Mega Man on the Mega Man Legacy Collection, and after like half an hour, I was at Dr. Wily. Of course, I was using the rewind feature, but that's the beauty of playing NES today. Like, you can just you've got those features now a lot of times, so use them. Like, that's the thing. Like, maybe. From having lived through that era, we understand that there was a certain context to when these games were released, and it might be hard to imagine now, but like there's so much more choice now. There was less then, and so like what you did back then is that you had maybe 1 or 2 games a year when you were a child. So if the game was really, really difficult, maybe you would never finish it, but you would keep playing it over and over again.
Yeah.
And eventually you might finish it.
If you could beat it in the afternoon you bought it, you'd probably feel scammed.
Or you just kept replaying it over and over again. You didn't really mind, depending on the game, if it was good.
Yeah, like if it rose to that quality. But like a lot of the NES games aren't good by modern standards as well. But that's
or even by their own standards at the time. I mean,
well, yeah, I was going to say like there are precious few that are really good by today's standards, because you have to think about how many years of iteration we have between us now and them then.
Yeah, and also the ability to save your game and that kind of stuff, which it became commonplace. Right?
Well,
which was, in the NES era was not commonplace for a while.
If you're talking about context, you really have to talk about the arcade and the shadow that cast. Like debate. I mean, it's certainly the impression I had as a child. I imagine I was not isolated in this because of the way things were. Arcade games were like the real games. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like that's like the pure shit. That's the grade A stuff. And what you get at home was less than that, right? Like it was like that. Arcade games were video games. And what you got at home was some sort of attenuated version of them. And the thing about that is that, you know, that was never like strictly true. Obviously, that's just the kind of the prism through which I see it as a child. But because the arcade games looked better.
It was absolutely true.
Well, it was true in some senses, right? But the arcade games look better, right? You know, you had like these, top game companies making these lavish experiences for arcades, doing things they couldn't do at home. Capcom, Sega, some of the top developers in the industry at that time were making these, bespoke experiences for arcade.
Well, the holy grail was to be able to produce arcade perfect console versions of games.
Absolutely. And a lot of the time it's like, well, maybe you've got Neo Geo games that are essentially arcade level experiences, but the Neo Geo is a preposterously expensive device that like 3 people in the UK probably owned at the time. Or, obviously things in Japan like the X68000, a computer that could do pretty close to arcade perfect stuff. The Capcom games of that era, the kind of CPS board games and stuff. Again, not that many people had them. So that was like the stuff, right? And the home games were, imitating that. Now, the thing about it is some home games were trying to strike out and say, well, let's do things differently. Let's, we have our own strengths, right? We don't have the flashy graphics and sound. We don't have like bespoke controllers or, special displays that arcade games could have. But what we do have is the long form kind of experience of it actually owning the game, right? And all this kind of stuff. So some would take advantage of that. Metroid, Legend of Zelda, some of those Disk System era games, Nintendo really kind of, and even, Super Mario Brothers just before that, as kind of one of the games that kind of closed out the pre-Disk System Famicom era from like 83 through to 85. They were starting to really kind of take advantage of what the home arena could do. But even then, they were still so influenced by arcade ideas, right? It's just like Zelda 2, I think, is a pretty good example. Like, what the hell are lives even doing in that game? Like, it is a baffling decision that can only be explained by the fact that just most video games of any sort were using them because arcade games basically were the kind of central point for the medium, and they used them because of the commercial model that, powered the arcade. So this is the thing. These sort of, this kind of context is what those games were born out of, where, they're making decisions that now, when arcades barely exist and have been largely irrelevant for several years, it just doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make them, kind of, wise whether you're looking at them in retrospect or any other perspective. But it's one of these things where obviously if you're somebody who kind of, grew up with games, being essentially derived from the arcade model, even if they weren't themselves arcade games, we much more kind of, if not, willing to like accept or embrace it in a particular case, you're still kind of like, oh, well, that's just the way things are, right? You could just go like, well, there's a lot of things that are like that. So I guess that's just it. Whereas, if you're really just looking at it with a critical eye, you could have said then, this doesn't make sense. So I can kind of see both sides of it in terms of, some of it is, just that's the environment those games were born out of. And it would have been very difficult. It would have taken a very confident designer to completely throw away the trappings of, the kind of arcade informed design that existed at that time. But equally for people now who, have no attachment or investment to that era of games and the ethos behind it, it's perfectly sensible and inevitable for them to say, well, this just doesn't add up, as a structure, as an incentive scheme, anything. It's kind of almost an anachronism when you've got something like what was mentioned with Zelda 2.
I do feel like just going after some late NES stuff. I think Kirby's Adventure is very good.
Absolutely, that's a great choice.
Mm-hmm.
And it does have saves, and it shows lots of gameplay variety. It's not overly hard. You can beat it relatively quickly, but it's got enough stuff that you can go and mess with to understand, like, this is what the NES could do. But also you have to keep in mind that game is almost 10 years of Nintendo themselves iterating on ideas.
Yeah.
Like, it is the product of, and granted, it wasn't produced at Nintendo, but, like, it was produced by people who were working with Nintendo intimately. Like, it is the product of, most of a decade of growth in how we think about games as a home experience. Because if you look back beyond the NES fail, if you start looking at what games were being produced for the home, in air quotes, you get into a very different space before the black box stuff comes around. And you can actually see it in a lot of the black box stuff, like the fucking pinball game.
Oh, yeah. That's a lot. But again, what the Famicom, again, coming out in 83, fair bit earlier than obviously the NES would launch in America. Those early years were very strongly just like arcade style experiences. First and foremost, a pretty decent version of stuff like Donkey Kong Jr. that were literally arcade games. And then other things that were just kind of like, yeah, we want to, pinball, being a good example. Devil World, we talked about that. It's basically just their take on Pac-Man. Like that's what the Famicom market was in the early days. And that's also exactly what Sega was doing in Japan at the same time. Obviously, they had a whole bunch of arcade games they were making in Japan, and they were bringing them over as best they could to the SG-1000 and then later the Mark III, as well as like chipping in with other things that were more home specific, but still very informed by that arcade design. And then it's really Super Mario Brothers and the disc system that kind of start to kind of push the boundaries in Japan. And then, obviously very much when they brought those games, the black box was definitely part of, what came over at first, but it wasn't long before you got onto stuff like, Kid Icarus and Metroid that were the password packs. So they had the silver boxes, and then of course Zelda in the gold box that actually had the battery save.
The battery save was a game changer for NES games, and the save isn't the issue with Zelda 2. Greg hit, like, it shouldn't have lives, but they didn't know what a Zelda game was. They'd made one of them.
I think it's even worse in Japan. I think the leveling up system or something is even more like counterintuitive or unkind or something. I forget. There is definitely some sort of difference there.
I can't. I haven't played Link's Adventure enough to remember. Do you always start from the same town at the beginning? Do you have to make all that progress again? Because that might be a difference. I
can't. The last time I played Zelda 2 was where we did a retroactive on it, and in 2009, I want to say. So
it's been a long time,
15 years or so. Yeah. So that, and I don't. The thing is, the nice thing about NSO now is you could at least mess around with the Famicom Disk System version if you kind of set up a Japan account and download the Japanese version of the app. You could probably have a look at that, and it's interesting just to see stuff like the differences with the music and the sound effects and things for stuff like Metroid, Kid Icarus, and so forth that went there. But yeah, it's just, James has got it in terms of, they're in an experimental phase. They're pushing at the boundaries of like, okay, yeah, especially with this disk system and the ability to save with the rewritable format, we can go beyond the arcade in style. But how specifically you do it, and how do you iterate on a game you've already made that was successful? They were really trying to figure that out, and they did a bunch of different things, because on the one hand you had a Zelda 2 that was radically different from the original, in terms of graphically, the play style, introducing more explicit RPG mechanics. And then on the other hand, you had Super Mario Bros. 2, which in Japan was effectively just a level pack for Super Mario Bros. 1. I mean,
right.
They couldn't be any more
fucked up and brutal.
Yes, absolutely. Much more just like explicitly, like, okay, we talked about this a little bit with the notion of Rare's games in Britain, for microcomputers and for NES, of like being part of this sort of, rather closed kind of mindset of like, the gamers are this little group of people and we're just all trying to stump each other by making the hardest thing we can think of. And that's like really what Super Mario Bros. 2 was in Japan. It's just like, oh, you think you're good because you've beaten Bowser, at the end of the original Super Mario Bros. Well, actually, in fact, this is going to kick your ass 8 ways from Sunday or whatever. And your poison mushrooms, wind, ridiculous springs, all these various gimmicks to make it tougher. So yeah, I mean, that's the point. They were experimenting and stuff. And I can understand why a lot of people, who don't have that kind of context, and feeling of like where these things came from, it's just not going to necessarily land for them, because, I said, when you really add it up, when you divorce it from the context and just look at it and its own merits and say, does this kind of hang together as something, that, kind of makes sense on its own terms? It doesn't necessarily, because they just, they were, everybody's guessing, right? Everybody's guessing about what the consumers will respond to at that time, in particular, because there wasn't some long history to base it on. And so they kind of, on the one hand, they're pushing boundaries, but on the other hand, they're sticking to conventions that they probably shouldn't.
So what comes what is very clear from Carl's emails, that he doesn't enjoy the NES games he's played very much. And I just want to say that's okay. That's fine. You don't have to.
No, absolutely.
That's the thing. Then, like, there's a passage that I find really kind of funny, like where Carl explains that the warp whistles and the warp pipes in Mario showed that the developers saw that there was a problem with the limited continues, but while those solutions like acknowledge a problem, they don't address it. And I feel like there's playing these games today kind of gives the writer a warped view of what these secrets were like when we saw them, when we found them the first time around, when we were playing those games back in the day. Like, first of all, the act of playing the games itself is the point, like I think that maybe like today it's more I don't know, like it's become, gaming has become a little bit like, just like almost everything else, a matter of productivity. for some people, like, oh, I have to get through as many games as I can, or I have to finish this game so I can move on to the next. I feel like that was maybe not so much the case back then, just because, again, as I said earlier, like you might have 1 or 2 games in a year, so you would play them and replay them over and over again anyway.
And the scarcity of games, like you said, in particular, just like it was a treat to be able to play video games at all.
Right.
So,
yeah.
it was not the sort of ubiquitousness of today where it's like, well, you've got a million different games at your fingertips at any moment. And, that's kind of, going into, well, if I am playing a video game, I want to be feeling like it's, in some sense, productive, as you mentioned, in some sense, like you're making progress or it's really worthy of your time and all that. And that is a difference that can't be denied. And so the notion that, obviously people who did play them back then, have this kind of relatively inflated value because they were these precious, scarce things to us versus, the people that never saw them that way. There's absolutely some truth in it. There's just no denying that disparity.
But there's like the warp pipes of Mario. Like, first of all, like back then you didn't have as easy a way to look up secrets as you do now. So, you might know about the warp pipes today because it's kind of like general knowledge, or, you can easily look up Mario secrets online. But back then you had to find those things for yourself, and it was always kind of a thrill when you found a new secret, or like a friend would tell you about them and you're like, what? Like, I've never found this. And like, then they would come over to your place and, they would show you, see, look, like you can go under, well, this is Super Nintendo, example, but I remember showing someone who had Super Mario World, like, see, you can use Yoshi and slide through, under the pole thing, at the end to get to a secret stage. Like, and, it just like blew like one of my brother's friends' minds with showing them that. So that's kind of how the info traveled. And those things are, those warps and those shortcuts are there so that you can, if you want, finish those games very, very quickly. Or you can decide to sit down and play Mario 3 from beginning to end, each and every level, if you've got the time ahead of you to do that. And that's possible. Like, it's just an option that you had, in front of you. So, I feel like it might be tougher to appreciate NES games today, but it says as much about how games were made back then as it does about, 2024. And I feel like we have a case maybe of like 2024 brain here, where it's just like you
there's always multiple difficulty levels that you can select from in every game. Things have evolved a lot. Yeah,
and like you've got so much more, like you've played games that were inspired by those old games, and so like they don't offer the kind of the novelty or the freshness that they would otherwise, because like that's one thing. Like I remember the first time I saw the movie Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. I thought like, well, this would probably blow my mind if it didn't feel so derivative, because it's so much like so many movies that I've seen that were inspired by Psycho.
Everyone ripped it off, didn't they? I mean, Brian De Palma made an entire career out of ripping off Hitchcock in general, and Psycho specifically very, very many times.
Yeah, so there's a little bit, like, you can't escape that, right? Like, you grew up playing video games, well, you've certainly, played games that were inspired by those early NES titles, and so I feel like maybe there's more of an effort that's required of the player to, kind of look up the context, try to put yourself in the shoes of like what it was to play those games at the time, because that's that's part of it.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that's where, some of these types of experiences that you see now with presenting older games like Atari 50, the Digital Eclipse kind of stuff, where they try and, convey some of these kind of like the place in history and, you know, kind of how it came to be the way that it was and all that. I think that it kind of demonstrates the value of some of those things for, you know, people who are really enthusiastic about it. I mean, it's not so different with other parts of media. You know, there's a lot of people that are just going to probably say, I'm not going to like watch like silent films. I'm not going to go back and, you know, kind of see, you know, some of these really important silent films that were made because it's just not going to, you know, elicit a very sort of satisfying emotional response, you know, from me or something. But there are equally people who will go back and watch, you know, stuff like Metropolis, for instance, you know, to see the effect and the influence that it had and what they were able to achieve at that time with the resources they had and find an interest in that. And that's, you know, that's just, again, the difference in in people's tastes, you know, and the level of kind of, satisfaction that they get from, you know, seeing where something comes from. And it's, you know, ultimately, you know, if these games are not fun, you know, to you, then, I mean, that's what they're meant to be doing, right? If you're trying to spend some time with these and it's not working, again, the opportunity cost principle, there's just so many other choices out there today that presumably could give you, you know, a much more enjoyable time. It's a terrible waste, you know, to plug away at things that aren't giving you a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, I'm not blaming Carl here for not getting into those games. I have trouble. Like, I would never play Mega Man today without the rewind feature. And I played them again just, you know, on the Wii Virtual Console, and I was fine with it. But something has changed in just like 10, 15 years. So yeah, like, you have to meet them halfway. I would just reiterate to the writer, like, don't feel obligated to even finish these games. You can just like sample them, like check out Ninja Gaiden for like a few levels, see like, okay, like this controlled pretty well. Those cutscenes must have been amazing at the time. This music kicks ass. And then once you've been killed enough times by a freaking bird, you can just, you know, okay, this is where I quit, and I'm going to watch the rest of those cutscenes on YouTube. And you're going to be like, who the hell is Jacques? And
that's where you quit if you're a quitter.
Exactly.
If you're a real man, you keep going until you beat it.
But also those games were difficult in that time period.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah, right? and also it's well established, I think, with Ninja Gaiden that bizarre thing at the end of the game where it sent you back not to the preceding like act or whatever they called it, but actually to like the beginning of the whole stage when you failed to beat the final boss was a bug. It wasn't even originally the intent, but then when they detected the bug, they actually thought, nah, we'll leave it that way because it makes it harder. Like it's
it was a bug, and then it was a feature.
And then it was a feature, yeah. So it's just these are the sorts of bizarre, seemingly sort of random circumstances that some of these things were created in.
I often have that thought: rot in hell, Tecmo.
Rot in hell, Tecmo.
Like you're always the weaker half of Koei, Tecmo. Where's your VHS game?
But that's one of the tricky parts about trying to give recommendations. To go back to that is even something like Kirby's Adventure, which I think is an excellent choice in many respects. You have the sort of similar problem of like, okay, but you know, would you recommend playing Kirby's Adventure over a more recent Kirby game?
No.
So yeah, that's the thing. I guess like if you're really trying to thread the needle, like it would probably be something that is at once like distinctly NES in a way that it really does have a quality about it. That's like they don't make these like they used to.
I reiterate, Hattress.
Yeah, but I would also I would also look at things like, I mean, I've talked about this before, where I play modern Madden games and they're unintelligible. I mean, give me something give me something like Super Tecmo Bowl on the NES. Or Tecmo Super. I think that the NES version is Tecmo Super Bowl.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Yeah. But I would say there's certain games like that where I enjoy the NES version of that type of game, in this case, sports game for NFL football, much more than anything on modern consoles. Same thing with like NHL 95, for instance.
But yeah, you're really looking at the Genesis at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, but, you know, that's the kind of thing where just because something is on the NES doesn't mean it's necessarily a degraded experience of any sort. compared to modern consoles. It's just a very different experience, but it might be more enjoyable.
Well, and again, the influence, the pervasive influence of that arcade mindset. On the one hand, we might well, and quite fairly so, associate it with some of these kind of the quarter munching bullshit, basically, of enemies that drop in from nowhere, really difficult to avoid. It's just one of these things that you almost have to either memorize or just like accept and kind of work around taking that much damage at that particular point in the level. All that bullshit stuff. But there was also, I think, a legitimate upside, which, as we already mentioned, I think early on with the question, is, I think still applicable today, which is arcade games had to be instantly accessible. There had to be something you could grasp, just like, you get attracted to the thing by the demo and the noise that it was making and the pretty graphics.
By it yelling at you from across the arcade.
Exactly. But then you just, okay, this thing, it's probably got like a joystick and 2 buttons. Back, let's go. I can play this. It's everything's made, it's intuitive. It's accessible. Those principles also, kind of pervaded through NES games. And I would have think to people of certain tastes that still carries some weight. That is still worth something. Although I'd say, probably Nintendo have been, among the most cognizant of the need to keep that going of anybody, of like, no, we can't just keep making games that get increasingly convoluted. The ability to come in and dial something back, or even, to take on a genre that has become bloated and introspective, like fighting games, and then do something like Smash Brothers with it, where it's like, okay, this is basically like regular attack, special attack with directional modifiers, and totally refresh it and make it accessible to more people. Like that, they have never completely left it behind the way that I think maybe other developers have been guilty of.
As for my recommendations for NES games, I would just turn to co-op NES games that you can play with someone else, like maybe someone older who's played those games before. When my brother-in-law we gave him last year a NES Classic. And so, he's been playing, Double Dragon 2 with his kids. So that's a good one if you don't intend to see it through, because the last stage, or the next to that, the penultimate stage is pretty bullshit with the jumps. But Double Dragon 2 is really good. Or games like Super Spike V-Ball is a great volleyball game. And it's got, again, a kick-ass soundtrack. Super Dodgeball is a lot of fun. Yeah, I don't know, Contra, stuff like that. That's, it's all good stuff.
Yeah, Contra's a good choice as well.
Yeah, and actually available with the Contra collection, because for years the original Contra was not available for whatever reason.
Right.
It was an unlockable in Contra 4 on DS, but other than that, it wasn't on Virtual Console and stuff. But now with that collection, you can not just play the NES Contra, but you can play the Famicom version that was a bit fancier because it had their custom memory mappers in there or whatever that Konami had in cartridges in Japan. So it's obviously it's famous again for its code that gave you a bunch of lives and stuff. So it's got to feed it into Carl's argument there about, if you've got
it acknowledges the problem but doesn't address it.
It's a kind of a band-aid, it's not a fundamental address to the problem. But I do think, again, just one more time on this point, it's part of that, kind of trying to straddle the line of living up to people's expectations of what a game should be like. And of course, this was an adaptation of literally an adaptation of an arcade game in Contra's case. It was quite different in the arcades, Contra, because it was a vertical for aspect ratio game, I believe, Contra and Super C as well, but Super Contra in the arcades. I think it was Super C when it came to NES. But again, some of those games back then, the really smart ones did some very clever things with saying, what can we do better at home? Like Bionic Commando. would be another one, which I would love to be able to recommend, like Contra, because it's on a collection somewhere. But sadly, with some of the themes and scenario in that game, it probably isn't coming back anytime soon, seemingly. But that's pretty great because it's got a very unique kind of mechanic to it and everything. And just to get, but yeah, I'm sure if you look back at it, you could say there's more of those arcade sort of rough edges that they could have sanded off, but they actually did a lot of smart things in adapting that to the home and the longer form experience that really sort of, especially in retrospect when all the flash of arcades back then has passed, it's not impressive particularly to us in the same way anymore. You can say, yeah, like the home game was better in a lot in some of those cases. So it wasn't all bad in that regard by any means.
No. All right, I think we've done enough to defend the honor of the NES. And I think we've done enough podcasting for this week with weird hypotheticals and I don't know. We haven't even mentioned any masked individuals, despite the fact the number of masked individuals in the RFN canon continues to increase. So that's interesting.
We also roasted Tecmo, which is always good.
We did.
While praising their sports games from the era.
That's true.
Very fair.
Even-handed journalism.
Exactly.
That's what this is.
Reminding
fair
you that
or balanced.
But only one. I want you to email us. I do. I really, it would, I'm still in recovery mode. I'm feeling down a lot because it sucks to get hurt. It sucks to not be able to work out or do things I love. So I want you to help me out. This is my plea to you. Send me an email about content for the show. Don't just send me an email and go, yo, what's up? I don't need that. Which I know I now have just led to that. So that joke won't be funny because you'll be the 8th person to do it. I'm sorry. Emails. They go to rfn@nintendoworldreport.com. I've said the email 8 times today. So it should be beaten into your brain. I want you to come up with the question. It could be silly. It can be serious. It can be anything in between. But send it to rfn@nintendoworldreport.com. What I also want you to do, I want you to think up a question that you're not asking us. This is I know this, we're getting deeply metaphorical here, but just hang with me. We're going to get there. The Nintendo investor briefing for last quarter, the Q&A session, came out about a week ago now. And it is full of non-answers, nonsense, non-logic, and just complete and utter obliviousness. We did not get anyone asking for tickets to a theme park that had not even been designed yet. I feel like that is going to be the high water mark for a very long time. But what I want you to do, besides sending us your normal questions and email topics, I want you to put yourself in the mind of a Nintendo investor at the QA event. And you have heard somebody ask about how Nintendo is going to fix the yen, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I didn't know they ran the Central Bank of Japan, but they do. I want you to put yourself in the mind of an investor, an institutional investor. And you now have Nintendo's executives, us in this case. Just imagine. And you're going to ask us any question you think is germane from an investment standpoint. We might just answer them. Who can say? But I'd like you to go review the Nintendo investor Q&A session beforehand. I think it's enlightening. What's the opposite of enlightening? What is when you read something and you feel like you know less as a consequence of it? Is there a word for that? Deadening?
Stupefying.
Stupefying. Yes, that's the word you want. Stupefying. Yes. I think reading the investor Q&A is a consistently stupefying experience. I encourage you to do that. You already listened to RFN. You should be used to this. And send us some ideas, some prompts, and we will get it to the Nintendo executives so that they can provide you a meaningful, well-reasoned, well-thought-out, and definitely in no way stupid answer. And also, Skype just decided to send me an update. What the fuck, Skype? Get out of here. So I'm going to go block Skype, and we're going to end the show on that note. So, again, that's rfn@nintendoworldreport.com. Greg, what music are we going to end the show with?
Well, given the email that we ended the show on, I guess there's an element of, is this fitting or is this not? But we do have be a few days from when this podcast go live, the upcoming launch of Nintendo World Championships NES Edition. And I think it's been established at this point that it is indeed co-developed with Indie Zero, who also did the NES Remix games. Hardly a surprise, given the significant overlap with the concepts there. There's a non-trivial difference there in terms of the kind of ROM hacky things of like, play the last boss of Super Mario Bros. 3 with Princess Peach instead of Mario. Like that, you're not going to get any of that in the World Championships games. But, it's nice to see that they're still making stuff with Indie Zero, because they made quite a lot of things I've enjoyed, like the Theatre Rhythm games. And so I had the Ultimate NES remix on 3DS of those games, although with a title like that, you might think that it had like all the constituent games in, but it didn't. Because there was quite the first NES remix was more based on the kind of the black box, the earlier games. And then the second one was more based around kind of the more advanced big hitters of the later part of the NES's life. Ultimate just was like kind of a weird mix of the two. It wasn't like one or the other. It had some missing from either one of them on 3DS, but you still got the idea. It was, kind of, a nice way, maybe again, of like, chopping up those experiences and making them more accessible for people that might find the full kind of experience the way with all the kind of restrictions and oddities in balancing that those actually had at the time, being able to enjoy them in the absence of those things. So we'll see how well the Nintendo World Championships kind of functions in a similar way with all this kind of time attack stuff, and it kind of seems like they're going to be doing a similar thing to like the WarioWare Get It Together, where you've got those kind of challenges, like for like a leaderboard for a week, like everybody can try and get like a certain level of achievement on, which I thought kind of worked for WarioWare Get It Together. I think you did quite a few of those, didn't you, James? Those Yeah, so that could be interesting. But the NES Remix also had some nice, original music. It's mostly, obviously, it's going to be the songs from those games. They had some where, they would actually be a remix of the original music based on the variation of the scenario, like a wintry version of the Super Mario Brothers theme or whatever. But what I'm going with is something, more from the menus where they kind of had, NES instruments alongside, richer, more natural ones, and this is the stage results theme. It's really kind of, I don't know whether one of the songs like this might have actually been eShop music at some point, but a lot of it has got that kind of feel to it. The days of, those, Muse in 3DS eShop songs before we got to the oppressive silence of the Switch one.
All right. Well, on that, it is time for us to go. Bye, everybody.
Later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.